Welcome to History for Snooze. Every thread of history is woven with meaning, carrying stories of identity, status, and the beauty of human expression. In the age of kings and queens, monasteries and marketplaces, fashion was more than simple clothing. It was a language, spoken through colors, fabrics, and the way one adorned themselves in the medieval world. Tonight, we step into that world of medieval dress and fashion. From the rough wool of peasants to the silken robes of nobles, every garment revealed something about its wearer. Colors whispered of wealth or humility, and details of embroidery or fur trim told silent tales of power, faith, and desire. So, as you listen, imagine the rustle of linen in candlelight halls, the shimmer of jewels at a royal feast, and the humble garments of villagers gathered by fire. Each piece of clothing, no matter how simple or grand, carried with it the rhythm of everyday life. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your presence keeps these quiet journeys alive. And in the comments, share your thoughts or where you're listening from. It's a joy to know how these stories travel across time and place. Now, rest easy, and let us wander together through the fabrics and fashions of the Middle Ages, where clothing was never just cloth, but a reflection of the world that wore it. Medieval fashion represents one of the most fascinating and complex chapters in the history of human dress. Spanning nearly a millennium from the fall of the Western Roman Empire around 500 CE to the dawn of the Renaissance around 1500 CE, medieval clothing evolved from simple, practical garments to increasingly elaborate displays of wealth, status, and artistic achievement. This transformation reflects not only changing aesthetic preferences but also profound shifts in society, economy, technology, and cultural values. The study of medieval fashion requires us to consider clothing not merely as protection from the elements or matters of personal taste, but as a sophisticated system of communication. In a largely illiterate society where visual symbols carried enormous weight, clothing served as an immediate indicator of social rank, occupation, regional origin, marital status, and religious affiliation. The cut of a sleeve, the color of a dye, or the presence of certain decorative elements could convey information as precisely as a written document. Understanding medieval fashion also means grappling with the limitations of our sources. Unlike contemporary fashion, which is extensively documented through photographs, magazines, and video, medieval clothing must be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. Scattered surviving garments, artistic representations in manuscripts and sculpture, written descriptions in literature and legal documents, and archaeological finds. Each type of source brings its own biases and limitations, requiring careful interpretation and cross-referencing. The geographical scope of medieval fashion encompasses the entirety of Western and Central Europe, from the Atlantic shores of Ireland and Portugal to the eastern borders of Poland and Hungary. While this vast region shared certain common influences through Christianity, trade networks, and political connections, it also maintained distinctive regional traditions that give medieval fashion its rich diversity. Perhaps most importantly, medieval fashion was profoundly hierarchical. In an age where social mobility was limited and class distinctions were considered divinely ordained, clothing served as one of the primary means of maintaining and displaying these crucial boundaries. Sumptuary laws, which regulated who could wear what materials and styles, were not merely about economic control but about preserving the visual markers that made society legible and stable. The early medieval period, often called the Dark Ages, witnessed the transformation of European dress from the sophisticated tailoring of the late Roman Empire to the simpler, more practical garments that would characterize much of the medieval millennium. This transformation was driven by multiple factors: the collapse of centralized Roman authority, the movement of Germanic tribes into former Roman territories, the decline of urban centers and their specialized craftsmen, and the gradual emergence of new political and economic structures. The clothing of the early medieval period represents a fascinating synthesis of Roman and Germanic traditions. Roman dress had been characterized by draped garments like the toga and stola, which required minimal sewing but considerable skill in arrangement. Germanic dress, by contrast, favored fitted garments that were sewn together from multiple pieces of cloth. The collision and combination of these two traditions created the foundation for all subsequent European fashion. The basic male garment of the early medieval period was the tunic, descended from the Roman tunica but influenced by Germanic traditions of fitted clothing. Early medieval tunics were typically knee-length for common men and ankle-length for the wealthy and clergy. They were constructed from two rectangular pieces of cloth sewn together at the sides, with holes cut for the head and arms. The simplicity of this construction reflected both the limited tailoring skills available and the practical needs of a society focused on survival rather than display. Women's dress in this period centered around the long tunic or gown, often called a kirtle. Like men's tunics, these were constructed from rectangular pieces of cloth, but they typically extended to the ankles and were often more closely fitted at the torso. Over this basic garment, women might wear a shorter overtunic or a cloak, depending on the weather and their social status. The various Germanic tribes that settled in former Roman territories each brought their own clothing traditions, which gradually blended with Roman styles and with each other. The Franks, who would eventually give their name to France, favored long tunics and cloaks fastened with elaborate fibulae, brooches. The Visigoths in Spain developed a distinctive style that combined Roman and Germanic elements with influences from North Africa. The Anglo-Saxons in Britain created a clothing tradition that would remain relatively isolated from continental developments for several centuries. Archaeological evidence from Germanic graves provides valuable insights into early medieval dress. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England, dating to the early 7th century, contained elaborate gold jewelry and weapon fittings that suggest a highly sophisticated understanding of metalwork and decoration. Similarly, the Lombard graves of northern Italy have yielded intricate fibulae and belt fittings that demonstrate the continuing importance of personal adornment even in this supposedly dark age. Germanic influence can also be seen in the adoption of trousers or leg coverings, garments that had been considered barbaric by the Romans but were eminently practical for the cooler climates of northern Europe. These early trousers were quite different from modern versions, often consisting of separate leg coverings that were tied to a belt at the waist and might not be joined together at the crotch. From the earliest centuries of the medieval period, the Christian Church exerted enormous influence on fashion and dress codes. Clerical clothing served multiple functions. It distinguished religious officials from lay people, it conveyed the relative ranks within the church hierarchy, and it embodied Christian values of modesty and otherworldliness. The basic garment of early medieval clergy was the alb, a long white tunic that symbolized purity and spiritual cleanliness. Over this, higher-ranking clerics wore various additional garments. The chasuble, a circular cloak worn during Mass, the dalmatic, a wide-sleeved overtunic, and various other vestments that developed increasingly complex symbolic meanings. The Church's influence extended far beyond clerical dress. Christian morality emphasized modesty, humility, and the rejection of worldly vanity, values that theoretically discouraged excessive attention to clothing and appearance. In practice, however, the Church itself became one of the greatest patrons of luxury textile production, commissioning elaborate vestments, altar cloths, and ceremonial garments that represented some of the finest artistic achievements of the medieval period. Early church councils established rules about appropriate dress for both clergy and lay people. The Council of Gangra in the 4th century condemned those who wore unusual clothing to display their piety, while later councils would regulate everything from the length of clerical tonsures to the colors appropriate for various ranks of clergy. The early medieval period saw significant changes in textile production and trade. The collapse of the Roman Empire disrupted the complex trade networks that had supplied fine silks from China, cottons from India, and luxury dyes from various corners of the known world. For several centuries, European textile production became largely localized, with most communities producing their own cloth from locally available materials. Wool became the dominant fiber in Northern Europe, where sheep could be raised even on marginal land. The quality of wool varied enormously, from the coarse cloth suitable for peasant garments to the fine wools that would eventually make Flemish and English cloth famous throughout Europe. In Mediterranean regions, linen remained important, produced from locally grown flax. The production of textiles was labor-intensive and highly skilled work, much of it performed by women. The process of turning raw wool into finished cloth involved numerous steps: cleaning and combing the wool, spinning it into thread, dyeing the thread, if colored cloth was desired, weaving the thread into cloth, and then finishing the cloth through various processes of cleaning, pressing, and sometimes napping. During this period, much textile production took place in domestic settings, with families producing cloth primarily for their own use. However, archaeological evidence suggests that some communities developed specializations in textile production quite early. The famous cloth seals found at various medieval sites indicate that certain regions were already developing reputations for particular types of textiles. The early medieval period saw both continuity and change in the use of colors and dyes. Some of the most prized Roman dyes, particularly the famous Tyrian purple made from murex shells, became increasingly rare and expensive as trade networks collapsed. However, local dyeing traditions continued and developed, often using materials readily available in the European countryside. Red dyes could be produced from madder root, a plant that grew wild in much of Europe and could also be cultivated. Yellow came from weld, another European plant, while blue could be obtained from woad, which grew particularly well in northern France and England. These three dyes could be combined to produce a range of other colors, though the intensity and permanence of the colors varied greatly depending on the skill of the dyer and the quality of the mordants used to fix the dyes. Brown and black were often produced using iron-based dyes, which were readily available but could be harsh on the fibers. The wealthy might still afford imported dyes like kermes, for red, or indigo, for blue, but such luxuries were rare and extremely expensive. The symbolism of colors was already developing during this period. White was associated with purity and was particularly important in clerical dress. Red suggested power and authority, while purple retained its association with imperial or royal status. Black was often associated with mourning or penitence, though it was also sometimes worn by the wealthy as a sign of sophistication. Even in the supposedly egalitarian world of early medieval Europe, clothing served to mark important social distinctions. The basic hierarchy was between free and unfree, with slaves and serfs having access only to the coarsest materials and simplest garments. Among the free population, distinctions were marked by the quality of materials, the complexity of construction, and the presence of decorative elements. The warrior elite distinguished themselves through elaborate weapons and jewelry as much as through clothing. The famous Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, composed sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, contains numerous descriptions of warriors adorned with gold rings, decorated sword hilts, and fine mail armor. These descriptions, while poetic, probably reflect actual practices of display and gift-giving among the early medieval elite. Kings and other rulers faced particular challenges in displaying their status through dress. In a world where Roman imperial insignia were no longer available or appropriate, new symbols of authority had to be developed. The Merovingian kings of France adopted long hair as a symbol of their royal status, while various Germanic rulers used particular types of jewelry or weapons to indicate their authority. The early medieval period saw the development of distinctive regional clothing traditions that would persist for centuries. In the British Isles, relative isolation from continental Europe allowed Anglo-Saxon dress to develop along somewhat different lines, with particular emphasis on elaborate jewelry and metalwork. Irish clothing seems to have retained more Celtic characteristics, with distinctive cloak fastening techniques and decorative motifs. In Scandinavia, the demands of the harsh climate and the seafaring lifestyle created their own distinctive clothing traditions. Archaeological finds from places like Hathabu and Burka show a sophisticated understanding of layered clothing for warmth, with multiple tunics worn one over the other and extensive use of fur and leather. The Mediterranean regions, while sharing in the general trends towards simpler, more practical clothing, retained more of their Roman heritage. Italian dress, particularly in regions that remained under Byzantine control, showed continued influence from Constantinople and the Eastern Empire. The reign of Charlemagne, 768 to 814 CE, and his successors brought about what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of renewed interest in learning, art, and culture. This revival also extended to clothing and fashion, with the Carolingian court setting new standards for luxury and display. Charlemagne himself was described by his biographer Einhard as preferring simple Frankish dress, but the court around him was increasingly elaborate. The famous ivory depicting Charlemagne or his grandson shows a figure dressed in elaborate robes that combine Germanic and Roman elements with new decorative motifs. The Carolingian period saw the development of new types of luxury textiles, particularly elaborate silk weaves that incorporated gold and silver threads. These textiles were often imported from the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, but there is evidence that some luxury weaving also took place in Carolingian territories. Carolingian manuscript illuminations provide valuable evidence for clothing styles of this period. The figures in these manuscripts wear a variety of garments, from simple tunics to elaborate robes, often with decorative borders and complex drapery that suggests sophisticated tailoring techniques. The impact of Viking raids and expansion. The Viking Age, roughly from the late 8th to the 11th century, had a profound impact on European clothing and fashion. The Vikings themselves were skilled textile workers, as evidenced by archaeological finds from sites like Jorvik, York, and Dublin. Their expansion throughout Europe, from Ireland to Russia, created new trade networks that facilitated the exchange of materials, techniques, and styles. Viking clothing was practical and well adapted to their lifestyle. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics over trousers, with cloaks for warmth and protection. Women wore long gowns, often with distinctive brooches that held up apron-like overgowns. The quality of Viking textiles was often very high, with complex tablet-woven borders and sophisticated dyeing techniques. The Viking expansion also brought new materials into European circulation. Viking traders brought furs from the far north, amber from the Baltic, and silk from as far away as China via the trade routes through Russia. These materials gradually found their way into the clothing of the European elite, adding new textures and possibilities to medieval fashion. Technology and innovation. The early medieval period saw several important technological innovations that would have lasting impacts on clothing and fashion. The horizontal loom, which produced better and more consistent cloth than earlier vertical looms, became widespread during this period. The spinning wheel, probably introduced from the Islamic world, began to supplement the traditional spindle and distaff, increasing the speed of thread production. Improvements in metalworking techniques led to better scissors, needles, and other tools essential for clothing construction. The development of the heavy plow and other agricultural innovations freed some labor from food production, allowing for greater specialization in textile work. Perhaps most importantly, the early medieval period saw the gradual development of the tailoring techniques that would make possible the fitted clothing of the later medieval period. While early medieval garments were still largely constructed from rectangular pieces of cloth, archaeological evidence shows experimentation with curved seams, gussets, and other techniques for creating more closely fitted garments. Women's roles in textile production. Women played a crucial role in textile production throughout the early medieval period, a role that gave them significant economic importance even in a society that otherwise offered them limited opportunities. The Anglo-Saxon term, spinster, literally, one who spins, reflects the central importance of spinning in women's work, while the modern saying about the distaff side of the family recalls the distaff used in spinning. Noble women often supervised large textile workshops that produced not only clothing for their households but also luxury textiles that could be given as gifts or used in trade. The famous Bayeux tapestry, probably produced in the late 11th century, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of women's textile work from this period. Monastic women were particularly important in maintaining and developing textile skills. Convents often served as centers of textile production, creating elaborate vestments and altar cloths that combined technical skill with artistic vision. The famous textiles associated with St. Cuthbert, preserved at Durham Cathedral, may have been produced in such a monastic setting. The High Medieval period represents the flowering of medieval civilization, characterized by the rise of cities, the development of universities, the construction of great cathedrals, and the elaboration of courtly culture. These broader changes were reflected in clothing and fashion, which became increasingly sophisticated, varied, and socially significant during these 3 centuries. The rise of urban centers and specialized crafts. One of the most important developments of the High Medieval period was the revival of urban life and the growth of specialized crafts. Cities like Paris, Milan, Florence, Bruges, and London became centers of textile production and trade, with highly organized guilds controlling every aspect of the clothing industry from the production of raw materials to the sale of finished garments. The guild system represented a sophisticated form of economic organization that had profound impacts on fashion and clothing. Different guilds controlled different aspects of textile production. Weavers, dyers, fullers, tailors, and haberdashers each had their own organizations with strict rules about who could practice these crafts and how they should be conducted. This specialization led to dramatic improvements in the quality and variety of available textiles and garments. The rise of guilds also led to the development of new types of clothing professionals. Tailors, who had existed in rudimentary forms during the early medieval period, became highly skilled artisans capable of creating complex fitted garments. The emergence of professional embroiderers, many of them women working in organized workshops, made possible the elaborate decorative work that characterized high medieval fashion. Urban markets created new opportunities for fashion innovation and diffusion. Wealthy urban merchants competed with the traditional nobility in displays of luxury, while urban craftsmen had access to a wider variety of materials and techniques than their rural counterparts. Cities also served as centers of fashion communication, with styles spreading along trade routes and diplomatic connections. The development of fitted clothing. Perhaps the most dramatic change in high medieval fashion was the development of truly fitted clothing. While early medieval garments had been constructed primarily from rectangular pieces of cloth, high medieval tailors learned to cut cloth on the bias, to use curved seams, and to incorporate complex pattern pieces that followed the contours of the human body. This revolution in tailoring probably began in the 12th century and reached its full development by the 13th. Archaeological evidence from places like London's medieval waterfront shows increasingly sophisticated tailoring techniques, with complex patterns involving dozens of separate pieces sewn together with remarkable precision. The development of fitted clothing had profound social and cultural implications. Tight-fitting garments revealed the shape of the body in ways that loose-fitting robes did not, leading to new debates about modesty and appropriateness. The Church, in particular, was concerned about the moral implications of clothing that emphasized bodily form, leading to repeated condemnations of vanity in dress. Fitted clothing also required much more skill and time to produce than simple rectangular garments, making it an effective marker of wealth and status. A well-fitted gown or tunic demonstrated not only that the wearer could afford expensive materials but also that they had access to skilled professional tailors. The emergence of fashion as a concept. The high medieval period saw the emergence of something approaching fashion in the modern sense. The idea that clothing styles should change regularly and that staying current with these changes was socially important. This represented a dramatic shift from the early medieval emphasis on tradition and stability in dress. The development of fashion was closely linked to the rise of courtly culture. The great courts of the period, like those of the French kings at Paris, the English kings at Westminster, or the Holy Roman emperors at their various residences, became centers of style innovation. Courtiers competed to display their sophistication through their clothing, leading to rapid changes in styles and a new emphasis on novelty. Literary sources from the period provide evidence of growing fashion consciousness. The Romance literature that flourished during the high medieval period contains detailed descriptions of clothing that suggest both author and audience were deeply interested in the nuances of dress. Works like Chrétien de Troyes' Arthurian romances or the anonymous Sir Gawain and the Green Knight contain extensive passages describing the clothing of their characters, often with remarkable attention to detail. The concept of fashion also created new social tensions. Traditional authorities, particularly the Church, worried that rapid changes in clothing styles represented a dangerous rejection of stable social order. Sumptuary laws, which attempted to regulate who could wear what, became increasingly common and increasingly detailed during this period. Men's fashion in the high medieval period. Men's clothing during the high medieval period evolved from the simple tunics of the earlier period to increasingly complex and fitted garments. The basic male garment remained the tunic, but it now came in various lengths and levels of fit. Young men of the nobility often wore quite short tunics that barely reached the thigh, while older men and clerics preferred longer versions. The development of hose, close-fitting leg coverings that were often brightly colored and made from fine wool or silk, was one of the most distinctive features of high medieval men's fashion. These garments required sophisticated tailoring to achieve their close fit and were often made by specialist hosiers who were among the most skilled textile workers of the period. Over their tunics, men might wear various types of outer garments. The surcoat, a loose over-tunic often worn without sleeves, became popular among the nobility and was frequently decorated with heraldic devices. Cloaks remained important for travel and ceremonial occasions, with the quality of the fur lining serving as an important status marker. The introduction of buttons during this period represented a significant technological innovation. While earlier garments had been fastened with ties, pins, or brooches, buttons allowed for more secure and adjustable fastening. The earliest buttons were primarily decorative, but by the 13th century they had become functional elements that enabled entirely new approaches to garment construction. Women's fashion in the high medieval period. Women's fashion during the high medieval period became increasingly elaborate and sophisticated. The basic female garment was still the long gown or kirtle, but these garments now featured much more complex construction, with fitted bodices, flowing skirts, and elaborate sleeve treatments. One of the most characteristic features of high medieval women's fashion was the emphasis on long, flowing lines. Gowns often featured trains that extended far behind the wearer, while sleeves might be so long that they nearly touched the ground. These impractical elements served to demonstrate that the wearer was wealthy enough not to need to perform manual labor. The surcoat, similar to the male version but longer and often more fitted, became an important element of women's fashion. Female surcoats were often sleeveless or had very wide sleeves, and they were frequently worn over close-fitting undergowns that provided the actual structure and support for the outfit. Headwear became increasingly important and elaborate during this period. Married women were expected to cover their hair completely, leading to the development of various types of veils, wimples, and caps. These head coverings often involved complex arrangements of linen or silk and could require considerable skill to arrange properly. The influence of the Crusades. The Crusades, which began at the end of the 11th century and continued through the 13th century, had a profound impact on European fashion. The military campaigns themselves necessitated new types of clothing and armor, while contact with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world introduced European nobility to new materials, techniques, and aesthetic ideas. Crusader clothing had to be practical for the harsh conditions of military campaigning in foreign climates. This led to innovations in the construction of gambesons, padded undergarments worn beneath armor, improvements in the design of surcoats worn over armor, and the development of new types of headgear suitable for use with helmets. The Crusades also facilitated trade and cultural exchange. Crusaders returning from the East brought with them silk textiles, new dyeing techniques, and aesthetic ideas that influenced European fashion. The famous cloth of gold textiles, which incorporated actual gold threads into silk weaving, became available to European nobles through these Eastern connections. Islamic influence on European fashion during this period was particularly significant in Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexisted for several centuries. The sophisticated textile traditions of Islamic Spain, particularly in cities like Córdoba and Seville, influenced fashion throughout Europe through trade and diplomatic contacts. Heraldry and clothing. The development of heraldic systems during the High Medieval period had a significant impact on fashion and clothing decoration. Heraldry emerged in the 12th century as a system for identifying knights in battle, but it quickly expanded to become a complex visual language for representing family relationships, territorial claims, and social status. Heraldic devices appeared on many types of clothing, from the surcoats worn over armor to the gowns worn by noble ladies. These decorations served multiple functions. They identified the wearer's family and allegiances, they demonstrated the wearer's right to bear particular arms, and they provided opportunities for elaborate artistic display. The rules governing heraldic display became increasingly complex during this period, with specialized heralds responsible for maintaining the accuracy and appropriateness of armorial bearings. This created new opportunities for skilled embroiderers and textile artists, who were needed to execute heraldic designs on clothing and other textiles. Heraldic influence extended beyond simple display of family arms. The geometric patterns and bold color combinations characteristic of heraldry influenced broader trends in textile design, contributing to the development of the distinctive aesthetic of high medieval art and fashion. Monastic dress and religious influence. Monastic dress during the High Medieval period became increasingly standardized and symbolic. The great monastic orders that emerged or reformed during this period, the Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans, Dominicans, and others, each developed distinctive habits that served both practical and symbolic functions. The Benedictine habit, with its black robe and hood, became the model for much subsequent monastic dress. The Cistercians, seeking to reform what they saw as Benedictine luxury, adopted undyed wool habits that were gray or brown in color. The new mendicant orders of the 13th century, the Franciscans and Dominicans, developed even simpler habits that reflected their commitment to poverty. Monastic dress influenced secular fashion in several ways. The emphasis on modesty and simplicity in religious dress provided a counterpoint to the increasing elaboration of secular fashion, creating ongoing tensions about appropriate dress. At the same time, monasteries were major centers of textile production, creating some of the finest fabrics available for both religious and secular use. The High Medieval period also saw the development of distinctive dress for cathedral clergy. Bishops, archbishops, and other high-ranking clerics wore increasingly elaborate vestments that combined religious symbolism with displays of wealth and artistic sophistication. These vestments often represented the finest textile work available, incorporating precious materials and complex decorative techniques. Textile technology and innovation. The High Medieval period saw significant advances in textile technology that made possible the increasingly sophisticated fashions of the era. The introduction of the spinning wheel, probably from the Islamic world, dramatically increased the speed of thread production and allowed for the creation of finer, more consistent threads. Water-powered fulling mills, which cleaned and thickened woolen cloth, became common during this period, particularly in regions like Flanders and northern Italy where textile production was becoming industrialized. These mills could process cloth more efficiently and consistently than traditional hand fulling, leading to improvements in cloth quality. Advances in dyeing technology, including the introduction of new mordants and dye materials, made possible a much wider range of colors and improved color fastness. The famous scarlet dyes produced in cities like Florence and the blue dyes of Toulouse became renowned throughout Europe for their quality and intensity. The period also saw improvements in weaving technology, with more sophisticated looms capable of producing complex patterns. The development of silk weaving in Italian cities like Lucca and Venice created luxury textiles that rivaled those produced in the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world. Trade and the textile economy. The revival of long-distance trade during the High Medieval period had a profound impact on clothing and fashion. Italian merchants established trading networks that stretched from England to the Levant, facilitating the exchange of raw materials, finished textiles, and fashion ideas. The famous trade fairs of Champagne, held at cities like Troyes and Provence, became major centers for textile commerce. Merchants from throughout Europe gathered at these fairs to buy and sell cloth, furs, dyes, and other materials essential to the fashion industry. The fairs also served as centers for the dissemination of new styles and techniques. Maritime trade became increasingly important during this period. The Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi established trade routes that brought Eastern luxuries to European markets. The Hanseatic League in Northern Europe created similar networks focused on the Baltic and North Sea trade. The growth of textile trade led to the development of new financial instruments and commercial practices. Italian bankers created credit systems that allowed merchants to finance large textile purchases, while the development of standardized weights and measures facilitated international trade. Social stratification and sumptuary laws. The increasing complexity and expense of high medieval fashion created new opportunities for social display but also new social tensions. The traditional nobility found themselves competing with wealthy merchants and urban professionals who could afford luxury clothing previously reserved for the aristocracy. Sumptuary laws, which regulated who could wear what types of clothing, became increasingly common and detailed during this period. These laws attempted to preserve traditional social distinctions by restricting certain materials, colors, or styles to particular social ranks. For example, only nobles might be permitted to wear cloth of gold, or only knights might wear certain colors. However, sumptuary laws were difficult to enforce and were frequently violated. Wealthy merchants often ignored restrictions on their dress, while nobles sometimes found themselves unable to afford the luxury clothing that their rank supposedly required. The repeated passage of sumptuary laws throughout the period suggests that they were largely ineffective in maintaining traditional dress codes. The development of new types of social distinction also created new categories of appropriate dress. University students, urban professionals, and members of religious confraternities all developed distinctive clothing traditions that marked their particular status and affiliations. Regional developments and variations. Different regions of Europe developed distinctive fashion traditions during the High Medieval period, though increasing trade and communication led to greater similarities than had existed during the early medieval period. French fashion, centered on the royal court at Paris, became particularly influential throughout Europe, setting styles that were copied by nobility in other kingdoms. Italian fashion was heavily influenced by trade connections with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Italian textiles, particularly silks produced in cities like Lucca and Venice, were renowned throughout Europe for their quality and sophistication. Italian tailoring techniques, influenced by contact with Eastern traditions, were often more advanced than those found elsewhere in Europe. English fashion developed somewhat differently, with particular emphasis on fine wool cloths and distinctive embroidery techniques. The famous opus Anglicanum, elaborate ecclesiastical embroidery produced in English workshops, was sought after throughout Europe for its technical excellence and artistic sophistication. Germanic regions developed their own distinctive traditions, often characterized by more conservative styles and emphasis on traditional materials like linen and wool. The Holy Roman Empire's complex political structure led to numerous local variations in dress, though imperial court fashion provided some unifying influence. The role of women in fashion. Women played crucial roles in high medieval fashion as both producers and consumers. As producers, women dominated many aspects of textile work, from spinning and weaving to embroidery and garment construction. Female textile workers were often organized into their own guilds or worked in workshops supervised by master craftswomen. As consumers, women were often the primary drivers of fashion innovation and change. Noble and wealthy merchant women competed to display their family's status through their clothing, leading to rapid changes in styles and increasing elaboration of dress. Literary sources suggest that women were often more fashion-conscious than men and were more willing to adopt new styles. Women also served as important transmitters of fashion ideas through their roles in arranging marriages, conducting diplomacy, and maintaining social networks. A noble woman moving from one court to another might bring new fashion ideas with her, while diplomatic marriages often led to exchanges of clothing styles between different regions. The increasing importance of women in fashion during this period created some tension with traditional religious and moral authorities, who worried that female attention to dress represented dangerous vanity and pride. This tension would continue throughout the medieval period and beyond. The late medieval period, spanning roughly from 1300 to 1500 CE, represents both the culmination of medieval fashion and the beginning of its transformation into something recognizably modern. This period witnessed dramatic changes in clothing styles, the emergence of truly international fashion, and the development of the commercial and technological foundations that would support the fashion industry of the Renaissance and beyond. The crisis of the 14th century and its impact on fashion. The 14th century opened with a series of crises that profoundly affected European society and, consequently, fashion and dress. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, followed by the devastating Black Death of 1347 to 1351, killed perhaps one-third of Europe's population and disrupted traditional social and economic structures. These crises had complex effects on fashion, both constraining and liberating sartorial expression in unexpected ways. The massive population losses created labor shortages that, paradoxically, improved the economic position of surviving workers. Peasants and urban laborers found themselves with greater bargaining power and higher wages, allowing some to afford better clothing than their social position had traditionally permitted. This led to increased tensions over appropriate dress and more frequent attempts at sumptuary regulation. At the same time, the disruption of traditional social structures created opportunities for new forms of fashion expression. The old feudal order, based on fixed relationships between lords and vassals, began to give way to more fluid arrangements based on money and contractual relationships. This social mobility was reflected in clothing, with successful merchants and professionals increasingly able to dress in ways previously reserved for the nobility. The psychological impact of the plague also influenced fashion. Faced with the constant possibility of sudden death, many people embraced a philosophy of living for the moment that expressed itself partly through attention to luxury and display in dress. The famous excesses of fashion in the late 14th and 15th centuries can be understood partly as a response to the trauma and uncertainty of the plague years. The Burgundian court and the international style. Perhaps no single institution was more important to the development of late medieval fashion than the court of the Dukes of Burgundy. From their establishment as an independent duchy in 1363 until their absorption into the Habsburg domains in 1477, the Burgundian dukes created the most splendid and influential court in Europe, one that set fashion standards imitated throughout the continent. The Burgundian court was consciously international, drawing courtiers, artists, and craftsmen from throughout Europe. This cosmopolitan character was reflected in its fashion, which synthesized influences from France, Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries into a distinctive style that became the standard for European court dress. Duke Philip the Good, r. 1419 to 1467, was particularly influential in establishing Burgundian fashion leadership. His court was famous for its elaborate ceremonies, magnificent tournaments, and complex etiquette, all of which required appropriate dress. The Duke himself was known for his attention to fashion, and court records show enormous expenditures on clothing and jewelry. The Burgundian style was characterized by several distinctive features: extremely elongated silhouettes, elaborate headwear, rich materials, and complex construction techniques. Both men and women wore clothing that emphasized height and elegance, often through the use of long, flowing lines and careful attention to proportions. Burgundian influence spread throughout Europe through diplomatic contacts, dynastic marriages, and cultural exchange. Many European courts attempted to imitate Burgundian fashion, leading to what historians call the international style of the late 14th and 15th centuries. Revolutionary changes in men's fashion. Men's fashion underwent perhaps more dramatic changes during the late medieval period than women's fashion. The most striking development was the dramatic shortening of men's tunics, which by the mid-14th century had shrunk to barely cover the hips. This represented a complete reversal of earlier fashion trends and created a silhouette that was entirely new in European dress. The short tunic, often called a doublet or pourpoint, was typically worn with close-fitting hose that covered the legs completely. This combination created a silhouette that emphasized the male form in ways that would have been considered shocking in earlier periods. The church condemned these new fashions as immodest and inappropriate, but they spread rapidly throughout European courts despite clerical opposition. The construction of these fitted garments required sophisticated tailoring techniques. Doublets were often made from dozens of separate pieces, carefully shaped and sewn together to create a close fit that followed the contours of the torso. Padding was sometimes used to enhance the natural shape of the body, creating the broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted silhouette that became characteristic of late medieval male fashion. Sleeves became increasingly elaborate during this period, often featuring complex construction with multiple pieces and decorative elements. The technique of slashing, where cuts were made in the outer fabric to reveal contrasting material beneath, became popular and would remain a feature of European fashion for centuries. The codpiece, a covering for the genital area that was often padded and decorated, became a standard element of male dress during this period. While serving a practical function in an era of extremely tight-fitting clothing, the codpiece also became a symbol of masculine virility and was often made a decorative focal point of the outfit. The evolution of women's fashion. Women's fashion during the late medieval period was characterized by increasing elaboration and the development of distinctive regional styles. The basic silhouette remained relatively conservative compared to men's fashion, with long gowns continuing to be the norm, but the construction and decoration of these garments became increasingly sophisticated. The fitted bodice, which had been developing throughout the high medieval period, reached new levels of precision during the late medieval era. Women's gowns were often constructed with separate bodices and skirts, allowing for more precise fitting and greater variety in design. The bodice was typically closely fitted through the torso and often featured decorative lacing or buttons. One of the most characteristic features of late medieval women's fashion was the emphasis on the waist. The natural waistline was often raised or lowered for aesthetic effect, and belts or sashes were used to create the desired silhouette. This attention to waist definition required sophisticated undergarments, including early forms of corsetry that provided the necessary support and shaping. Sleeves became increasingly elaborate and varied during this period. They might be tight-fitting or extremely full, short or so long that they nearly touched the ground. Detachable sleeves, which could be changed to vary the appearance of a gown, became popular among the wealthy. The technique of dagging, where the edges of sleeves or skirts were cut into decorative points or scallops, was particularly fashionable. The houppelande, a voluminous gown with extremely full sleeves and often a high collar, became one of the most characteristic garments of the late medieval period. Worn by both men and women, though in different versions, the houppelande could be made from enormous quantities of fabric and represented a significant display of wealth. Headwear and hair fashions. Perhaps no aspect of late medieval fashion was more distinctive or more subject to change than headwear and hair arrangements. Both men and women wore increasingly elaborate head coverings that became focal points of fashionable display and symbols of social status. For women, the period saw the development of some of the most extraordinary headwear in the history of fashion. The hennin, a tall conical headdress worn with a flowing veil, became synonymous with late medieval fashion. These headdresses could reach extraordinary heights, sometimes extending several feet above the wearer's head, and required considerable skill to arrange and wear properly. Other popular women's headdresses included the escoffion, a padded roll worn around the head, the reticulated headdress, which consisted of a net or caul that contained the hair, and various forms of veils and wimples. Many of these headdresses were so elaborate that they required the assistance of servants to arrange properly. Men's headwear was generally less elaborate than women's, but it still showed considerable variety and innovation. The chaperon, which evolved from a simple hood into a complex turban-like arrangement, became particularly popular. Caps, berets, and various forms of hats were worn, often decorated with jewels, feathers, or other ornaments. Hair fashions for both men and women underwent significant changes during this period. Men's hairstyles varied from the long hair fashionable in the early part of the period to the shorter styles that became popular later. The famous bowl cut, associated with medieval men, actually represents only one of many different hairstyles worn during the period. Women's hair was typically covered in public, but the arrangements beneath the head coverings were often elaborate. Hair might be braided, coiled, or arranged in complex patterns, sometimes with the addition of false hair to create the desired effect. The fashion for high foreheads led some women to pluck their hairlines to create a more elongated facial shape. The influence of Italian fashion. Italy's position as the center of European trade and banking gave Italian cities enormous influence over fashion during the late medieval period. Italian textile production, particularly in cities like Florence, Milan, and Venice, set new standards for quality and innovation that influenced fashion throughout Europe. Italian silk production reached new heights of sophistication during this period, with weavers developing complex patterns and techniques that created textiles of unprecedented beauty and complexity. The famous Florentine silk industry produced fabrics that were sought after by nobility throughout Europe, while Venetian merchants imported luxury materials from the East that were incorporated into European fashion. Italian fashion was also influenced by the peninsula's political fragmentation, which created numerous competing courts, each trying to outdo the others in magnificence. The courts of Milan, Ferrara, Mantua, and other Italian cities became centers of fashion innovation, developing distinctive styles that influenced broader European trends. The Italian emphasis on artistic excellence extended to clothing design and construction. Italian tailors and seamstresses were renowned throughout Europe for their skill, and many were brought to foreign courts to serve the nobility there. The techniques developed in Italian workshops often spread throughout Europe through this movement of skilled craftspeople. Renaissance humanism, which emerged in Italian cities during this period, also influenced fashion. The humanist emphasis on individual expression and the dignity of human life was reflected in clothing that celebrated the human form and individual taste rather than simply following traditional patterns. Trade networks and global influences. The late medieval period saw the expansion of trade networks that brought new materials and influences to European fashion. The establishment of regular trade routes to the East brought silk, spices, and other luxury goods to European markets, while the development of Atlantic trade began to introduce new world materials. The famous trade routes through Venice connected Europe to the markets of Constantinople, Alexandria, and ultimately to the silk and spice routes of Asia. These connections brought not only materials but also aesthetic influences that shaped European fashion. Islamic textiles, with their complex geometric patterns and sophisticated dyeing techniques, influenced European textile design throughout the period. The Hanseatic League in Northern Europe created trade networks that connected the Baltic region to the rest of Europe, bringing furs, amber, and other northern products to international markets. These materials became important elements in European fashion, with fur serving as both a practical necessity in cold climates and a symbol of luxury and status. The expansion of Atlantic trade toward the end of the period began to introduce new world materials to European fashion. While the full impact of these new materials would not be felt until the 16th century, the late medieval period saw the beginning of what would become a global fashion system. Technological innovations in textile production. The late medieval period witnessed several important technological innovations that transformed textile production and made possible the increasingly sophisticated fashions of the era. The development of more efficient spinning wheels increased the speed of thread production and allowed for the creation of finer, more consistent threads. Water-powered machinery became more common in textile production, with mills for fulling cloth, powering looms, and other textile processes. These technological improvements made it possible to produce higher quality cloth more efficiently, reducing costs and making fine textiles available to a broader range of consumers. Advances in dyeing technology created new possibilities for color and pattern in textiles. The development of new mordants and dyeing techniques allowed for more intense and permanent colors, while the introduction of new dye materials expanded the range of available colors. The period also saw innovations in textile finishing techniques. The development of more sophisticated fulling processes created cloth with better texture and appearance, while new techniques for pressing and finishing cloth improved its quality and durability. Armor and military fashion. The late medieval period saw the development of plate armor to its highest form, and this military technology had significant influences on civilian fashion. The techniques used in shaping metal for armor were adapted for creating the complex shapes required for fitted civilian clothing. The aesthetic of plate armor, with its emphasis on smooth, flowing lines and precise fit, influenced civilian fashion in numerous ways. The fitted doublet worn by civilian men in the late medieval period shows clear influence from the arming doublet worn beneath armor, while the emphasis on broad shoulders and narrow waists in male fashion reflected the silhouette created by plate armor. Military orders and knightly culture continued to influence fashion throughout the period. The elaborate ceremonies of chivalric orders like the Order of the Golden Fleece or the Order of the Garter required appropriate dress, leading to the development of ceremonial garments that influenced broader fashion trends. The increasing professionalization of military forces during this period also created new categories of military dress. Professional soldiers developed distinctive clothing traditions that marked their occupation and allegiances, while military engineers, artillery specialists, and other technical personnel developed their own dress codes. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 had profound and lasting effects on European fashion. The massive population losses disrupted traditional social structures and created new opportunities for social mobility, which were reflected in changing dress codes and fashion practices. The economic disruption caused by the plague led to significant changes in textile production and trade. Many textile centers were devastated by population losses, leading to shifts in production to new centers. At the same time, the reduced population meant that survivors often had access to better clothing and textiles than their social position would traditionally have permitted. The psychological impact of the plague also influenced fashion. Faced with the constant possibility of sudden death, many people embraced a philosophy of living for the moment that was expressed partly through increased attention to luxury and display in dress. This contributed to the increasingly elaborate fashions of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The plague also led to increased religious devotion, which was reflected in clothing through the popularity of religious symbols and motifs, the growth of religious confraternities with distinctive dress, and increased attention to the moral implications of clothing choices. Sumptuary legislation and social control. The rapid changes in fashion during the late medieval period led to increasingly detailed sumptuary legislation as authorities attempted to maintain traditional social distinctions. These laws became more specific and more frequently updated as fashions changed rapidly and traditional hierarchies were challenged. Late medieval sumptuary laws often specified not only what materials different social groups could wear but also details of construction, decoration, and even color. For example, laws might specify the maximum length of trains, the types of fur that different ranks could wear, or the number of buttons permitted on different garments. However, these laws were difficult to enforce and were frequently violated. The growth of urban wealth meant that many merchants and professionals could afford clothing that their legal status did not permit them to wear. The repeated passage of sumptuary laws throughout the period suggests that they were largely ineffective in controlling fashion. The failure of sumptuary legislation reflects broader changes in European society during the late medieval period. The old feudal order, based on fixed relationships and traditional authority, was giving way to a more fluid society based on money and contractual relationships. Fashion both reflected and contributed to these broader social changes. Regional variations and national styles. While international influences were strong during the late medieval period, different regions of Europe continued to develop distinctive fashion traditions. These regional variations reflected local climate conditions, available materials, cultural preferences, and political circumstances. French fashion remained influential throughout the period, particularly in the areas controlled by the French crown. The French court at Paris continued to set styles that were imitated throughout Europe, while French textile centers like Paris and Rouen produced luxury goods that were exported internationally. Italian fashion developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the peninsula's unique political and economic situation. The fragmentation of Italy into numerous competing city-states created multiple centers of fashion innovation, while Italy's position at the center of European trade networks brought exotic influences from throughout the known world. English fashion developed somewhat differently, influenced by the island's relative isolation and distinctive political traditions. English wool remained the finest in Europe, and English textile workers developed distinctive techniques for processing and finishing cloth. The English court, while influenced by continental fashions, maintained its own distinctive traditions. Germanic regions showed considerable diversity in fashion, reflecting the complex political situation of the Holy Roman Empire. Different regions developed distinctive traditions, though imperial court fashion and the influence of major trading cities like Nuremberg and Augsburg provided some unifying elements. The role of guilds and professional organizations. The guild system reached its highest development during the late medieval period and had enormous influence on fashion and textile production. Guilds controlled every aspect of the fashion industry, from the production of raw materials to the sale of finished garments, and their regulations shaped the development of fashion in important ways. Different textile guilds often competed with each other for control of particular markets or techniques, leading to innovations and improvements in quality. The guild system also provided training for skilled craftspeople and maintained standards of quality that ensured the reputation of particular cities or regions for specific types of textiles. The guild system was not without its problems. Guild regulations could be restrictive and conservative, slowing innovation and preventing the adoption of new techniques. Guild monopolies also kept prices high and limited access to luxury goods. Despite these problems, the guild system provided the organizational framework that made possible the sophisticated textile production of the late medieval period. Professional organizations for tailors, embroiderers, and other fashion workers became increasingly important during this period. These organizations provided training, maintained quality standards, and protected the interests of their members. They also played important roles in urban politics and social life. Women continued to play crucial roles in textile production throughout the late medieval period, though their roles were often undervalued or overlooked in official records. Women dominated many aspects of textile work, including spinning, weaving, embroidery, and garment construction. Female textile workers were sometimes organized into their own guilds, though more often they worked within male-dominated guild structures. Women's guilds, where they existed, often had less political power and economic influence than male guilds, reflecting broader patterns of gender inequality in medieval society. Despite these limitations, women made crucial contributions to fashion and textile innovation during this period. Female embroiderers created some of the finest decorative work of the era, while female textile workers developed many of the techniques that made possible the sophisticated fashions of the late medieval period. Noble and wealthy merchant women served as important patrons of the fashion industry, commissioning elaborate garments and supporting skilled craftspeople. Their taste and preferences shaped fashion trends, and their competition for social display drove much of the innovation in late medieval fashion. Noble and wealthy merchant women served as important patrons of the fashion industry, commissioning elaborate garments and supporting skilled craftspeople. Their taste and preferences shaped fashion trends, and their competition for social display drove much of the innovation in late medieval fashion. The transition to the Renaissance. By the end of the 15th century, medieval fashion was beginning to transform into something recognizably modern. The increasing influence of classical learning, the expansion of trade networks, and the development of new technologies all contributed to changes that would culminate in the Renaissance fashion of the 16th century. The discovery of the Americas opened new possibilities for trade and brought new materials to European markets. While the full impact of these discoveries would not be felt until later, the late 15th century saw the beginning of what would become a global fashion system. The development of printing technology made possible the circulation of fashion information in new ways. While fashion plates would not appear until later, the late medieval period saw the beginning of the processes that would make fashion information widely available. The growth of banking and credit systems made it easier to finance large textile purchases and support fashion industries. Italian banks, in particular, played crucial roles in financing textile production and trade throughout Europe. The story of medieval fashion is inseparable from the history of textiles and the materials from which clothing was made. The availability, quality, and cost of different materials shaped fashion possibilities throughout the medieval period, while innovations in textile production enabled new styles and aesthetic developments. Wool, the foundation of medieval textiles. Wool was the most important textile fiber in medieval Europe, providing the raw material for the vast majority of clothing worn by people of all social classes. The quality and characteristics of wool varied enormously depending on the breed of sheep, the climate and pasture where they were raised, and the processing techniques used to transform raw fleece into finished cloth. The finest wool in medieval Europe came from England, particularly from the Cotswolds and other regions where the climate and pasture produced sheep with exceptionally fine, long-stapled fleeces. English wool became so valued that it formed the basis of England's medieval economy and was exported throughout Europe to be processed in the textile centers of Flanders, Italy, and elsewhere. Different grades of wool served different purposes in the fashion hierarchy. The finest wools, with their long, silky fibers, could be woven into cloth so fine that it resembled silk. This luxury wool cloth was used for the garments of the nobility and wealthy merchants. Coarser wools were used for the clothing of ordinary people, while the coarsest wools were made into rough cloth suitable for work clothing. The processing of wool involved numerous steps, each requiring specialized skills and equipment. Raw fleece had to be cleaned, sorted, and combed to align the fibers. The cleaned wool was then spun into thread, a process that required considerable skill to produce thread of consistent quality and thickness. The thread was then woven into cloth on looms of varying sophistication. Wool's properties made it particularly suitable for medieval clothing. It provided excellent insulation against cold, it could absorb moisture without feeling wet, and it was naturally water repellent. Wool cloth could also be fulled, a process where the woven cloth was subjected to moisture, heat, and mechanical action to create a denser, stronger fabric with improved weather resistance. Linen, the noble fiber. Linen, made from the flax plant, was the second most important textile fiber in medieval Europe. Unlike wool, which was primarily used for outer garments, linen was particularly valued for undergarments, shirts, and other items worn next to the skin. Its smooth texture, absorbent properties, and ability to be washed frequently made it ideal for these purposes. The production of linen was extremely labor-intensive and required considerable skill. Flax had to be grown in appropriate soil and climate conditions, harvested at the right time, and then processed through a complex series of steps including retting, rotting away the plant matter around the fibers, breaking, scutching, and heckling to produce the fine fibers suitable for spinning. The finest linen came from regions with ideal climate conditions for growing flax, particularly parts of northern France, the Low Countries, and northern Italy. Flemish linen became particularly famous throughout Europe for its quality and fineness, with the best grades being almost as costly as silk. Linen's association with cleanliness and purity gave it important symbolic meanings in medieval culture. White linen undergarments were seen as signs of personal hygiene and moral virtue, while the church used fine linen for altar cloths and clerical vestments. The phrase clean linen became a metaphor for moral purity that persists to this day. The quality of linen varied enormously, from the coarse cloth used for household purposes to the finest grades that were used for luxury clothing and ecclesiastical purposes. The famous cloth of Reims was so fine that it was semi-transparent and was used for the most luxurious veils and undergarments. Silk, the ultimate luxury. Silk represented the ultimate luxury in medieval textiles, valued not only for its beauty and comfort but also for its rarity and exotic origins. For most of the medieval period, silk had to be imported from the Far East via the famous Silk Road, making it extremely expensive and available only to the wealthiest members of society. The Byzantine Empire served as the primary intermediary between European and Asian silk markets for much of the medieval period. Constantinople was famous for its silk workshops, which produced some of the finest textiles available anywhere in the world. Byzantine silk often featured complex patterns incorporating religious and imperial symbolism, and these textiles were highly prized by European nobility. The Islamic world was another important source of silk textiles for medieval Europe. Cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo were famous for their silk production, and Islamic textiles often featured distinctive geometric patterns and sophisticated dyeing techniques. The famous cloth of gold textiles, which incorporated actual gold threads into silk weaving, were often of Islamic origin. During the late medieval period, silk production began to develop in Western Europe, particularly in Italian cities like Lucca, Florence, and Venice. Italian silk producers initially copied Eastern techniques and patterns but gradually developed their own distinctive styles. By the end of the medieval period, Italian silk was competing successfully with Eastern products in European markets. Silk's properties made it particularly suitable for luxury clothing. Its smooth texture felt pleasant against the skin, its natural luster created beautiful visual effects, and its strength allowed for the creation of very fine, lightweight fabrics. Silk also took dyes better than other fibers, allowing for the creation of intense, brilliant colors. The symbolic associations of silk were as important as its practical properties. Silk was associated with royalty, nobility, and divine power, and its use was often restricted by sumptuary laws. The famous purple silk, worn by Byzantine emperors, became a symbol of imperial authority that was recognized throughout the medieval world. Cotton, the rare import. Cotton was known in medieval Europe but remained a rare and expensive import for most of the period. The cotton plant did not grow well in European climates, so cotton textiles had to be imported from regions where it grew naturally, particularly India, Egypt, and later the Islamic regions of Spain. Indian cotton textiles were particularly prized in medieval Europe for their fine quality and sophisticated dyeing and printing techniques. These textiles reached Europe via the traditional trade routes through the Middle East, making them extremely expensive and available only to the wealthiest consumers. Egyptian cotton was another important source, reaching Europe primarily through Venice and other Italian trading ports. The famous muslin fabrics, named after the Iraqi city of Mosul, were cotton textiles of exceptional fineness that were highly prized for luxury clothing. In Islamic Spain, cotton cultivation was introduced by Muslim settlers, and by the late medieval period, Spanish cotton textiles were beginning to compete with imported products. However, the Christian reconquest of Spain disrupted these industries, and cotton remained primarily an imported luxury throughout the medieval period. Cotton's properties made it valuable for specific purposes in medieval clothing. It was softer than linen and could be made into very fine, lightweight fabric suitable for summer clothing. Cotton also took dyes well and could be printed with complex patterns using techniques developed in India and the Islamic world. Fur, warmth and status. Fur played crucial roles in medieval clothing, serving both practical and symbolic functions. In the harsh climate of medieval Europe, fur provided essential warmth during the long winter months, while the type and quality of fur also served as important markers of social status and wealth. Different types of fur were associated with different social ranks and had complex symbolic meanings. Ermine, the white winter fur of the stoat, was particularly associated with royalty and high nobility. Its pure white color symbolized moral purity, while its rarity made it extremely valuable. Heraldic traditions associated ermine with royal authority, and it appeared frequently in royal portraits and ceremonies. Sable, the fur of the Siberian marten, was another extremely valuable fur that was associated with the highest levels of nobility. Sable had to be imported from Russia via complex trading networks, making it extremely expensive and rare in Western Europe. The deep brown color and lustrous quality of sable made it highly prized for luxury clothing. Vair, the fur of the Eurasian red squirrel, was commonly used in medieval heraldry and clothing. The distinctive blue-gray color of winter squirrel fur and its relative abundance in European forests made it more accessible than ermine or sable, though still expensive enough to be associated with the nobility. More common furs like rabbit, fox, and lamb were used by the merchant classes and lesser nobility. These furs provided warmth and comfort while still serving as markers of relative prosperity. The quality and preparation of these furs varied considerably, with the finest examples requiring skilled furriers to prepare and assemble. Fur was typically used as lining for outer garments rather than as the primary material. A wool or silk outer garment lined with fine fur provided both warmth and display of wealth, as the fur lining would be visible at the cuffs, collar, and hem of the garment. Exotic materials and decorative elements. Medieval fashion also incorporated various exotic materials that served primarily decorative rather than practical functions. These materials were often extremely expensive and were used sparingly as accents and embellishments on luxury garments. Silk threads incorporating real gold or silver were used to create cloth of gold and cloth of silver textiles that represented the ultimate in luxury. These textiles were so expensive that they were often recycled, with the precious metal threads being carefully extracted and reused in new garments. Pearls were highly valued in medieval fashion and were used to decorate both clothing and accessories. The finest pearls came from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, though European rivers also provided freshwater pearls of lesser quality. Pearls were often sewn directly onto garments or incorporated into jewelry worn with clothing. Precious and semi-precious stones were used to decorate clothing, particularly for ceremonial and court dress. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds, when available, were set into brooches, buttons, and other garments accessories. The symbolic meanings associated with different stones added layers of meaning to their decorative use. Amber, fossilized tree resin found primarily along the Baltic Sea coast, was widely used in medieval fashion. Its warm color and relative abundance made it more accessible than precious stones, while its supposed magical properties gave it special significance in medieval culture. Ivory, primarily from elephants but also from walruses and narwhals, was carved into decorative elements for luxury clothing. Ivory buttons, belt fittings, and other accessories were signs of wealth and sophistication, while the difficulty of obtaining and working ivory made such items extremely valuable. The colors available in medieval fashion were determined by the dyes that could be produced from natural materials, and the complexity and expense of different dyeing processes created a hierarchy of colors that reflected and reinforced social distinctions. Red was perhaps the most important color in medieval fashion, available in a range of shades depending on the dye source used. Madder root, which grew throughout Europe, provided a relatively inexpensive red dye that was widely used for everyday clothing. Kermes, made from insects that lived on oak trees in Mediterranean regions, produced a much more intense and expensive red that was associated with wealth and power. The most expensive red dye came from cochineal insects imported from Mexico after the Spanish conquest of the Americas, though this remained rare and extremely costly throughout the medieval period. The intensity and permanence of these high-quality red dyes made them suitable for the most prestigious garments. Blue dyes were primarily derived from woad, a plant that grew well in northern European climates. Woad produced a range of blue shades from light sky blue to deep navy, depending on the concentration and processing techniques used. The best woad came from regions like Toulouse in France and was exported throughout Europe. Indigo, imported from India, produced a deeper and more intense blue than woad but was much more expensive. The complex processing required to extract indigo dye and its rarity in European markets made it a luxury product associated with the wealthy. Purple, the most prestigious color in medieval fashion, was extremely difficult and expensive to produce. The famous Tyrian purple of the ancient world, made from murex shells, was virtually unavailable during most of the medieval period. Medieval purples were usually created by combining red and blue dyes, but the results were often less permanent and intense than true purple. Yellow dyes came primarily from weld, another European plant that was widely cultivated for dyeing purposes. Weld produced bright, permanent yellow colors that were relatively inexpensive and widely available. Saffron, the dried stigmas of crocus flowers, could also produce yellow dye but was extremely expensive and was more commonly used for cooking than dyeing. Green was typically produced by combining yellow and blue dyes, a process that required considerable skill to achieve consistent results. The two-step dyeing process and the risk of uneven coloring made green relatively expensive and sometimes unstable. Black was often produced using iron-based dyes combined with tannins from oak bark or other sources. While black dyes were relatively inexpensive to produce, achieving a deep, permanent black was difficult, and high-quality black cloth was actually quite expensive. White was the natural color of undyed linen and was associated with purity and cleanliness. Achieving truly white cloth required careful bleaching processes, often involving exposure to sunlight and various chemical treatments. Textile production centers. Different regions of medieval Europe developed specializations in particular types of textile production, creating a complex network of trade and exchange that supplied fashion throughout the continent. Flanders, particularly cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, became the most important textile production region in Northern Europe. Flemish textile workers developed sophisticated techniques for processing the fine English wool into luxury cloth that was exported throughout Europe. Flemish cloth became synonymous with quality and was highly prized by the nobility. Italian textile centers, particularly Florence, Milan, Venice, and Lucca, specialized in luxury textiles including fine wool cloth, silk, and elaborate decorative fabrics. Italian textile workers were renowned for their technical skill and artistic sophistication, and Italian textiles set the standard for luxury throughout Europe. English textile production focused primarily on wool processing and remained relatively underdeveloped compared to continental centers for most of the medieval period. However, English wool remained the finest raw material available, and England's control of this resource gave it considerable economic power. French textile production was centered in cities like Paris, Rouen, and Laterline. French textile workers developed particular expertise in luxury goods and court dress, while French silk production, introduced in the late medieval period, eventually became a major industry. German textile centers like Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Cologne developed specializations in particular types of cloth and served as important distribution centers for textiles produced throughout Central Europe. Medieval society was fundamentally hierarchical, with elaborate systems of rank and status that were considered divinely ordained and naturally determined. Clothing served as one of the primary means of making these social distinctions visible and maintaining the boundaries that kept society stable and legible. Understanding medieval fashion requires understanding the social structures it both reflected and helped to maintain. The Great Chain of Being. Medieval European society was organized according to what modern historians call the Great Chain of Being, a hierarchical conception of the universe that placed all of creation in a fixed order from God at the top down to inanimate matter at the bottom. Within human society, this translated into a complex system of ranks and orders, each with its appropriate place and function. At the top of secular society stood kings and emperors, who derived their authority directly from God and were expected to dress in ways that reflected their divine mandate. Royal dress incorporated the finest materials available and often included specific symbolic elements that had been associated with kingship since ancient times. The crown, scepter, and orb were the most obvious symbols, but royal dress also included specific colors, particularly purple, materials, especially silk and fur, and decorative elements that were legally reserved for royal use. Below the monarchy stood the various ranks of nobility, from great dukes and counts down to minor knights and squires. Each level of nobility had its appropriate dress codes, often specified in minute detail by law and custom. The difference between a duke and a count might be marked by the quality of fur used to line a robe, the number of jewels permitted on a coronet, or the specific shade of purple allowed in ceremonial dress. The church constituted a parallel hierarchy with its own elaborate dress codes. From the pope at the apex down through cardinals, archbishops, bishops, abbots, and ordinary priests, each rank had its specified vestments and ceremonial dress. Clerical dress was particularly important because it had to distinguish not only between different ranks within the church but also between the clergy and the laity. Sumptuary laws, legislating fashion. The complexity of medieval social hierarchies and the importance of maintaining visible distinctions between different ranks led to the development of sumptuary laws, legal codes that specified who could wear what materials, colors, and styles. These laws represent some of the most detailed fashion regulations in European history and provide valuable insights into medieval attitudes toward clothing and social order. Sumptuary laws typically organized society into a series of ranks or categories, each with specific clothing allowances. A typical law might specify that only nobles above a certain rank could wear silk, that merchants with property worth more than a certain amount could wear cloth of specified quality, and that peasants and artisans were restricted to particular types of coarse cloth. The enforcement of sumptuary laws was often problematic. Urban authorities might have some success in regulating dress within their jurisdictions, but enforcement across broader territories was difficult. Moreover, the rapid changes in fashion during the late medieval period meant that laws quickly became outdated and had to be frequently revised. The frequency with which sumptuary laws were passed suggests that they were largely ineffective in practice. The same restrictions appear repeatedly in different laws, indicating that previous regulations had failed to achieve their intended effects. This pattern suggests that sumptuary laws were more expressions of social anxiety about changing hierarchies than effective tools of social control. Despite their limited practical effectiveness, sumptuary laws had important symbolic functions. They represented official statements about appropriate social order and provided legal backing for traditional hierarchies that were being challenged by social and economic change. Noble dress and aristocratic identity. The medieval nobility developed elaborate dress codes that served multiple functions. They distinguished nobles from commoners, they marked different ranks within the nobility, and they reinforced the cultural values and ideologies that justified aristocratic privilege. Noble dress was characterized by several distinctive features that set it apart from the clothing of other social groups. The use of luxury materials like silk, fine wool, and expensive furs was perhaps the most obvious marker, but nobles also distinguished themselves through the cut and construction of their garments, the presence of heraldic decorations, and the overall elaborateness of their dress. The concept of magnificence was central to noble dress. Medieval aristocrats were expected to display their wealth and status through their clothing, not as a matter of personal vanity but as a social obligation. A noble who dressed too simply was failing in his or her duty to maintain the dignity of their rank and the stability of the social order. Military identity was crucial to medieval nobility, and this was reflected in their dress. Even when not wearing armor, nobles often incorporated military elements into their civilian clothing. Sword belts, spurs, and other military accessories were important markers of knightly status, while the colors and symbols of military orders appeared on both military and civilian dress. The seasonal cycle of aristocratic life was reflected in their clothing patterns. The great ceremonies of the Christian year, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, required appropriate ceremonial dress, while the hunting season, tournament season, and campaign season each had their associated clothing traditions. Merchant class aspirations and restrictions. The growth of urban centers and commercial activity during the high and late medieval periods created a wealthy merchant class that challenged traditional social hierarchies. Successful merchants often had more disposable income than minor nobles, but their social status remained ambiguous, and their dress reflected this tension between economic power and social limitations. Merchants attempted to display their wealth and respectability through their clothing, but they faced significant legal and social restrictions. Sumptuary laws often specified limits on the types of materials, colors, and decorative elements that merchants could use, regardless of their ability to afford more expensive items. The merchant response to these restrictions was often creative and subversive. Since they might be prohibited from wearing certain colors or materials, wealthy merchants would focus on the quality of permitted materials, the sophistication of construction, or the subtle details that marked fine craftsmanship. A merchant might be prohibited from wearing silk but could afford the finest wool available, tailored to perfection and finished with the highest skill. Merchant dress also reflected the practical demands of commercial life. Unlike nobles, who could focus primarily on display and ceremony, merchants needed clothing that was both impressive and practical. Their garments had to be suitable for travel, for conducting business in various settings, and for the day-to-day activities of commercial life. The international character of medieval commerce also influenced merchant dress. Merchants who traveled extensively often adopted elements of foreign styles, creating cosmopolitan fashions that distinguished them from both the provincial nobility and the local artisan classes. This international influence made merchant communities important centers for fashion innovation and diffusion. Clerical hierarchy and religious dress. The Catholic Church developed one of the most elaborate and codified systems of hierarchical dress in medieval Europe. Clerical vestments served multiple functions. They distinguished the clergy from lay people, they marked different ranks within the church hierarchy, and they embodied theological concepts about the nature of priesthood and divine authority. The basic principle of clerical dress was that it should be distinct from secular clothing and should reflect the otherworldly focus of religious life. However, in practice, clerical dress often incorporated luxury materials and elaborate decoration that rivaled or exceeded the magnificence of secular court dress. The Pope, as the head of the Universal Church, wore the most elaborate vestments, including the famous papal tiara, a triple crown symbolizing the Pope's temporal and spiritual authority, and robes made from the finest materials available. Papal vestments incorporated specific colors and symbols that had been associated with papal authority since the early centuries of Christianity. Cardinals, the Pope's principal advisors, were distinguished by their red vestments, symbolizing their willingness to shed their blood for the Church. The famous cardinal red became one of the most recognizable colors in medieval fashion and was strictly reserved for members of the College of Cardinals. Archbishops and bishops wore vestments that reflected their authority within their territories while acknowledging their subordination to papal authority. Episcopal vestments included the mitre, a ceremonial headdress, the pallium, a woolen band symbolizing episcopal authority, and elaborate ceremonial robes appropriate to their rank. Lower ranks of clergy, abbots, priests, deacons, and minor clerics wore progressively simpler vestments, though even ordinary priests wore special garments when celebrating Mass or performing other liturgical functions. The distinction between liturgical vestments, worn during religious ceremonies, and everyday clerical dress, worn in daily life, became increasingly important during the medieval period. Urban professionals and guild dress. The growth of medieval cities created new categories of professional workers, lawyers, doctors, teachers, scribes, and others, who occupied an intermediate position in the social hierarchy between merchants and artisans. These urban professionals developed distinctive dress traditions that reflected their education, status, and professional identity. University-trained professionals often wore academic dress that reflected their educational achievements. The famous academic gown, hood, and cap that are still worn at university ceremonies today have their origins in medieval academic dress. Different universities developed distinctive variations in academic costume, while different degrees and academic ranks were marked by specific colors, materials, and decorative elements. Legal professionals developed particularly distinctive dress codes. Judges and lawyers often wore robes that distinguished them from other professionals while emphasizing the dignity and authority of legal proceedings. The colors and styles of legal dress varied by jurisdiction but were typically conservative and formal, emphasizing the stability and continuity of legal institutions. Medical professionals, particularly university-trained physicians, also developed distinctive dress traditions. The famous doctor's robe worn by medieval physicians was designed to convey learning, authority, and respectability. Medical dress had to balance the need to appear learned and authoritative with practical considerations related to the often messy realities of medieval medical practice. Guild members developed dress traditions that reflected their particular crafts and their position within urban society. Master craftsmen often wore distinctive badges, colors, or garments that marked their professional identity and their authority within their guilds. These guild traditions helped maintain professional solidarity while distinguishing skilled craftsmen from unskilled laborers. Peasant and working-class dress. The vast majority of medieval Europeans were peasants and agricultural workers whose dress was determined primarily by practical considerations of cost, durability, and functionality. Peasant dress provides insights into the daily realities of medieval life and the constraints faced by those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Peasant clothing was typically made from coarse, locally produced materials, primarily wool and linen. The quality of peasant dress varied considerably depending on the prosperity of the individual and the region, but it was generally characterized by simplicity, durability, and practicality rather than fashion or display. The basic peasant wardrobe consisted of a limited number of garments designed for multiple uses. A peasant might own 1 or 2 sets of working clothes, a better outfit for church and special occasions, and seasonal items like heavy cloaks for winter. The durability of these garments was crucial, as peasants could not afford to replace clothing frequently. Peasant dress also reflected the seasonal cycle of agricultural work. Summer clothing had to be suitable for heavy physical labor in hot weather, while winter clothing needed to provide warmth during the long, cold months when outdoor work continued. Many peasants wore multiple layers that could be added or removed as conditions required. Regional variations in peasant dress reflected local climate conditions, available materials, and cultural traditions. Peasants in mountainous regions developed distinctive clothing adapted to harsh weather conditions, while those in warmer climates wore lighter garments suitable for their environment. Despite the practical focus of peasant dress, even the poorest people attempted to display their respectability and social aspirations through their clothing. Peasants might save for years to afford better clothing for church attendance or special occasions, and the quality of a peasant's best clothes served as an important marker of their position within the rural community. Gender and dress codes. Medieval dress codes were deeply gendered, with elaborate rules and expectations governing appropriate dress for men and women. These gendered dress codes reflected broader medieval ideas about the nature of masculinity and femininity and the proper roles of men and women in society. Women's dress was generally more constrained than men's dress, with greater emphasis on modesty, concealment, and conformity to religious and moral ideals. Married women, in particular, were expected to cover their hair completely in public, leading to the development of elaborate head coverings that became characteristic features of medieval women's fashion. The church played a particularly important role in defining appropriate dress for women. Religious authorities consistently emphasized the dangers of female vanity and the importance of modest dress. These religious teachings influenced not only the dress of religious women but also broader social expectations about appropriate female clothing. However, women's dress was not simply a matter of male control or religious oppression. Women, particularly wealthy women, used clothing as a means of expressing their identity, status, and taste within the constraints of social expectations. The elaborateness of many medieval women's garments suggests that women found ways to express themselves creatively even within restrictive social codes. Men's dress emphasized different values, particularly those associated with military prowess, social authority, and professional competence. The ability to bear arms was crucial to medieval masculine identity, and this was reflected in dress through the incorporation of military elements even in civilian clothing. The gendered nature of medieval dress also created opportunities for transgression and subversion. Historical records contain numerous references to people who violated gender norms through their clothing choices, suggesting that dress codes were contested and that some individuals found ways to challenge conventional expectations. Age-related dress distinctions. Medieval society had clear expectations about age-appropriate dress, with different life stages requiring different styles and levels of elaborateness. These age-related dress codes reflected medieval ideas about the proper progression of life and the responsibilities associated with different ages. Children's dress was generally simpler and more practical than adult dress, though wealthy children often wore miniature versions of adult clothing. The transition from childhood to adulthood was often marked by changes in dress, with young people adopting the clothing styles appropriate to their new social status. Young adults, particularly those from wealthy families, were often permitted or even expected to dress in the most elaborate and fashionable styles available. This was the time of life when physical attractiveness was most important for marriage prospects and social advancement, and clothing played a crucial role in these processes. Middle-aged adults were expected to dress in ways that reflected their established social position and responsibilities. The clothing of mature adults was generally more conservative than that of young people, emphasizing dignity and respectability rather than novelty or physical attractiveness. Elderly people were expected to dress simply and modestly, reflecting their approaching transition from worldly to spiritual concerns. However, elderly people of high social rank were still expected to maintain the dignity of their position through appropriate dress. Regional and cultural variations. While medieval Europe shared many common elements in its social hierarchy and dress codes, significant regional variations reflected local political structures, economic conditions, and cultural traditions. These regional differences created distinctive fashion traditions that persisted throughout the medieval period. The Italian city-states developed particularly sophisticated and varied dress traditions that reflected their commercial prosperity and political complexity. Different Italian cities often had distinctive styles, while the fragmented political situation created numerous competing courts, each with its own fashion traditions. The French monarchy's growing centralization and cultural influence made French court fashion increasingly influential throughout Europe. The French emphasis on elegance and sophistication set standards that were imitated by nobility throughout the continent. The Holy Roman Empire's complex political structure created numerous local variations in dress codes and fashion traditions. Different German principalities and cities developed distinctive styles, while the emperor's court provided some unifying influence. England's island location and distinctive political traditions created fashion developments that were sometimes different from continental trends. English emphasis on fine wool production and distinctive embroidery traditions created recognizable English styles. The Iberian Peninsula's history of Christian-Muslim interaction created unique fashion traditions that incorporated Islamic influences. The Christian reconquest of Spain disrupted some of these traditions but also led to the integration of Islamic elements into Christian European fashion. Religion permeated every aspect of medieval life, and its influence on fashion was both profound and multifaceted. The Catholic Church, as the dominant religious institution in Western Europe, shaped attitudes toward dress through theological teachings, moral prescriptions, and the development of elaborate liturgical vestments. At the same time, other religious influences, including Islamic culture in Spain and Jewish communities throughout Europe, contributed to the complex religious landscape that influenced medieval fashion. Christian theology and attitudes toward dress. Christian theology provided the fundamental framework for medieval attitudes toward clothing and personal appearance. The Church's teachings about the body, vanity, pride, and worldly concerns shaped not only religious dress but also broader social attitudes about appropriate clothing for all members of society. The concept of the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, derived from the writings of St. Paul, had profound implications for Christian attitudes toward dress. This theological principle suggested that clothing should respect the dignity of the human body while not drawing excessive attention to its physical characteristics. The challenge was to find a balance between appropriate care for the body and dangerous vanity about physical appearance. The 7 deadly sins, particularly pride and vanity, were central concerns in medieval discussions of clothing and fashion. Religious authorities consistently warned against the spiritual dangers of excessive attention to dress, arguing that concern for fashion distracted people from spiritual matters and encouraged sinful pride. The Christian emphasis on humility and otherworldliness created ongoing tensions with the social necessity of displaying rank and status through dress. This tension was particularly acute for wealthy Christians, who needed to maintain their social position while avoiding the spiritual dangers of worldly display. The theological concept of modesty was particularly important in shaping Christian attitudes toward dress. Modesty was understood not simply as covering the body appropriately but as maintaining proper humility and avoiding ostentation. This created complex debates about what constituted appropriate dress for different types of people in different circumstances. Liturgical vestments and sacred dress. The development of Christian liturgical vestments represents one of the most sophisticated systems of symbolic dress in human history. These sacred garments served multiple functions. They distinguished the clergy from lay people during religious ceremonies. They conveyed theological concepts about the nature of priesthood and divine authority, and they created a sense of sacred space and time through their use of special colors, materials, and symbolic elements. The theological concept of modesty was particularly important in shaping Christian attitudes toward dress. Modesty was understood not simply as covering the body appropriately but as maintaining proper humility and avoiding ostentation. This created complex debates about what constituted appropriate dress for different types of people in different circumstances. Liturgical vestments and sacred dress. The development of Christian liturgical vestments represents one of the most sophisticated systems of symbolic dress in human history. These sacred garments served multiple functions. They distinguished the clergy from lay people during religious ceremonies. They conveyed theological concepts about the nature of priesthood and divine authority, and they created a sense of sacred space and time through their use of special colors, materials, and symbolic elements. The basic structure of Christian liturgical vestments developed during the early centuries of the Church and remained relatively stable throughout the medieval period. The fundamental principle was that sacred vestments should be distinct from ordinary clothing and should reflect the special nature of religious ceremonies. The alb, a long white tunic, formed the foundation of most liturgical dress. Its white color symbolized purity and spiritual cleanliness, while its simple construction emphasized humility and service. Over the alb, clergy wore various additional vestments depending on their rank and the nature of the ceremony being performed. The chasuble, worn by priests during the celebration of Mass, was perhaps the most important liturgical vestment. This large, circular cloak symbolized the yoke of Christ and covered the priest completely during the most sacred parts of the Massachusetts. Chasubles were often made from the finest materials available and decorated with elaborate symbolic designs. The stole, a long strip of cloth worn around the neck, was another essential liturgical vestment that symbolized the priest's authority and the yoke of priestly service. Different ways of wearing the stole distinguished between different ranks of clergy and different types of ceremonies. Episcopal vestments, those worn by bishops, archbishops, and other high-ranking clergy, included additional elements that symbolized their authority and responsibility. The mitre, a ceremonial headdress, symbolized the bishop's spiritual authority, while the pallium, a woolen band, represented the bishop's connection to papal authority. The development of liturgical colors created a complex system of symbolic meaning that influenced broader attitudes toward color in medieval society. White was associated with purity and was used for feasts of Christ and the saints. Red symbolized the blood of martyrs and was used during feasts of martyred saints. Purple represented penitence and was used during Advent and Lent. Green, symbolizing growth and hope, was used during ordinary time. Black, representing mourning and penitence, was used for funerals and certain penitential occasions. Monastic dress and religious orders. The various monastic orders that flourished during the medieval period each developed distinctive habits that served both practical and symbolic functions. These religious garments had to be suitable for the particular lifestyle and work of each order while conveying important theological and spiritual messages. The Benedictine habit, with its black robe and hood, became the model for much subsequent monastic dress. The black color symbolized death to the world and spiritual seriousness, while the simple construction emphasized humility and poverty. The hood served both practical and symbolic functions, providing protection from weather while symbolizing the monks' withdrawal from worldly concerns. The Cistercian reform movement of the 12th century rejected what it saw as Benedictine luxury and adopted habits made from undyed wool. This created the distinctive gray or brown habits that became characteristic of Cistercian monasteries. The Cistercians' emphasis on simplicity and poverty in dress influenced broader discussions about appropriate religious clothing. The new mendicant orders of the 13th century, the Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and Carmelites, each developed distinctive habits that reflected their particular missions and spiritual emphases. The Franciscans adopted simple brown habits that emphasized their commitment to absolute poverty, while the Dominicans wore white habits with black cloaks that reflected their scholarly mission. Female religious orders developed their own distinctive traditions of religious dress. Nuns' habits shared many features with male monastic dress but included additional elements related to female religious life. The veil, which completely covered the hair and often the entire head, was the most distinctive feature of female religious dress and symbolized the nun's consecration to God. The development of religious habits influenced secular fashion in several ways. The emphasis on simplicity and modesty in religious dress provided a counterpoint to increasingly elaborate secular fashion, while the symbolic use of colors and materials in religious dress influenced broader cultural associations with different design elements. The Church's moral teaching on fashion. Throughout the medieval period, the Catholic Church maintained a complex and sometimes contradictory relationship with fashion and luxury in dress. While the Church itself commissioned and used elaborate textiles for liturgical purposes, religious authorities consistently warned laypeople about the spiritual dangers of excessive attention to clothing and appearance. Sermons and religious treatises regularly condemned what religious authorities saw as excessive concern with fashion. These condemnations focused on several main themes: the waste of resources that could be used for charitable purposes, the encouragement of sinful pride and vanity, the distraction from spiritual concerns, and the potential for inappropriate sexual attraction. The Church's position on fashion was complicated by the social necessity of maintaining appropriate distinctions between different ranks of society. Religious authorities generally accepted that people of different social positions should dress differently, but they warned against allowing these necessary distinctions to become occasions for sinful pride or competitive display. Particular aspects of fashion drew special criticism from religious authorities. Extremely tight-fitting clothing was condemned as immodest and inappropriate, while excessively elaborate ornamentation was criticized as vain and wasteful. Changes in fashion, particularly rapid changes, were often seen as signs of dangerous instability and rejection of traditional order. Women's fashion drew particular criticism from religious authorities, who saw female attention to dress as especially dangerous. The Church's teachings about women's role in the fall and their supposedly greater susceptibility to vanity created a framework that viewed female fashion with particular suspicion. Despite these criticisms, the Church's own practices often contradicted its moral teachings about fashion. The elaborate vestments used in liturgical ceremonies, the rich decorations of church buildings, and the luxury often associated with high-ranking clergy created tensions between religious teaching and religious practice. Islamic influences on European fashion. The presence of Islamic civilization in Spain and the extensive trade connections between Christian and Islamic regions had significant influences on European fashion throughout the medieval period. These influences operated through several different channels: direct cultural contact in Spain, trade in luxury goods, and the adoption of Islamic textile techniques and designs. In Islamic Spain, particularly in major cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities coexisted for centuries, creating opportunities for extensive cultural exchange. This interaction influenced fashion through the sharing of techniques, materials, and aesthetic preferences. Islamic textile production was generally more sophisticated than Christian European production for much of the medieval period. Islamic weavers developed advanced techniques for creating complex patterns, sophisticated dyeing methods, and innovative approaches to textile construction. These techniques gradually spread to Christian Europe through various forms of cultural contact. The geometric patterns characteristic of Islamic art had significant influences on European textile design. While Christian art favored figurative representations, Islamic geometric patterns offered alternative approaches to decoration that were adopted and adapted in Christian contexts. Islamic dress styles also influenced Christian fashion, particularly in regions where contact was extensive. The Islamic emphasis on covering the body, while different in its religious motivations from Christian modesty, created some parallel developments in dress codes and fashion practices. The luxury goods trade between Islamic and Christian regions introduced European consumers to materials and products that influenced their fashion preferences. Islamic silk textiles, with their sophisticated patterns and colors, set new standards for luxury that influenced European production and consumption. Jewish communities and dress. Jewish communities throughout medieval Europe developed distinctive dress traditions that reflected their religious requirements, cultural identity, and often precarious social position. Jewish dress had to balance religious obligations, community identity, safety concerns, and interactions with Christian society. Jewish religious law included specific requirements about dress that influenced Jewish fashion throughout the medieval period. The obligation for married women to cover their hair, similar to but distinct from Christian requirements, led to distinctive Jewish head coverings. The requirement for men to wear prayer shawls and other religious garments created elements of Jewish dress that had no Christian parallels. The social position of Jewish communities often required them to balance the desire to maintain their religious and cultural identity with the need to avoid attracting dangerous attention from Christian authorities or populations. This created complex negotiations about appropriate dress that varied significantly by time and place. Many Christian authorities attempted to force Jewish communities to wear distinctive clothing that would identify them as Jews. These discriminatory requirements, often called Jewish badges or distinctive hats, were intended to maintain social separation and prevent Christians from inadvertently associating with Jews. Despite these constraints, Jewish communities often developed sophisticated fashion traditions that reflected both their religious values and their often considerable commercial success. Jewish involvement in trade, particularly in luxury goods, gave many Jewish communities access to fine materials and current fashion trends. Jewish dress traditions also influenced Christian fashion in some regions, particularly where Jewish communities were large and economically important. The exchange of techniques, materials, and aesthetic ideas operated in both directions, creating complex patterns of cultural influence. Pilgrim dress and religious travel. The medieval practice of pilgrimage created distinctive dress traditions that influenced broader fashion developments. Pilgrims needed clothing that was suitable for long-distance travel while marking their religious purpose and providing protection during dangerous journeys. The basic pilgrim outfit consisted of practical garments suitable for walking long distances in various weather conditions. This typically included a sturdy cloak, comfortable walking shoes, and a hat for protection from sun and rain. The practical requirements of pilgrimage travel influenced the development of more functional clothing styles. Pilgrims also wore distinctive badges and symbols that identified their religious purpose and the shrines they had visited or intended to visit. These pilgrim badges became important elements of medieval fashion and were often retained and worn long after the pilgrimage was completed. The most famous pilgrimage routes, particularly the Camino de Santiago to the Shrine of St. James in Spain, developed their own fashion traditions. Pilgrims on the Santiago route traditionally wore scallop shells, the symbol of St. James, while those traveling to Rome wore crossed keys, the symbol of St. Peter. Pilgrimage fashion influenced broader clothing developments through the emphasis on practical, durable garments suitable for travel. The experience of long-distance travel also exposed pilgrims to different regional fashion traditions, contributing to the spread of fashion ideas throughout Europe. The religious meaning of pilgrimage dress also influenced secular fashion. The symbolic associations of particular colors, materials, and decorative elements used in pilgrim dress carried over into other contexts, contributing to the complex symbolic language of medieval clothing. Medieval Europe, despite sharing common elements of Christian culture, feudal social organization, and economic systems, displayed remarkable diversity in fashion and dress. Regional variations reflected differences in climate, available materials, political structures, trade connections, and cultural traditions. Understanding these regional differences is crucial for appreciating the full complexity of medieval fashion. French fashion leadership. France, particularly the region around Paris and the royal court, emerged as the leading center of fashion innovation and influence during the high and late medieval periods. French fashion leadership reflected the kingdom's political importance, economic prosperity, and cultural sophistication. The French royal court, established at Paris by the later Capetian kings, became the most influential fashion center in Europe. The court's elaborate ceremonies, sophisticated etiquette, and international connections created an environment where fashion innovation flourished. French courtiers competed to display their sophistication through their dress, leading to rapid changes in style and increasing elaboration of court costume. French textile production, centered in cities like Paris, Rouen, and later Lyons, developed distinctive characteristics that influenced fashion throughout Europe. French silk production, though introduced relatively late in the medieval period, quickly achieved high standards of quality and artistic sophistication. French embroidery and decorative work became particularly renowned for its elegance and refinement. The French emphasis on courtly culture and chivalric ideals influenced fashion preferences throughout Europe. French styles typically emphasized elegance, sophistication, and refined taste rather than ostentatious display. This aesthetic preference shaped fashion developments far beyond the borders of France. French fashion influence spread through several channels: diplomatic contacts, dynastic marriages, cultural exchange, and trade connections. Many European courts attempted to imitate French styles, while French fashion ideas spread through the international networks of nobility, clergy, and merchants. The development of French as the international language of diplomacy and court culture also contributed to French fashion influence. Many European nobles learned French and adopted French cultural preferences, including fashion choices, as markers of their sophistication and international awareness. Italian innovation and luxury. Italy's position at the center of European trade networks and its political fragmentation into numerous competing city-states created unique conditions for fashion innovation and luxury production. Italian fashion during the medieval period was characterized by technical sophistication, artistic excellence, and cosmopolitan influences. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi, controlled much of the trade between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, giving them access to luxury materials and fashion influences from the Byzantine Empire, Islamic world, and beyond. This international exposure influenced Italian fashion preferences and production techniques. Italian textile production achieved the highest levels of technical and artistic sophistication in medieval Europe. Cities like Florence, Milan, Venice, and Lucca became renowned for their luxury textiles, particularly silk fabrics that incorporated complex patterns, sophisticated dyeing techniques, and innovative construction methods. The political fragmentation of Italy created numerous competing courts, each attempting to outdo the others in magnificence and display. This competition drove fashion innovation and led to the development of increasingly elaborate and sophisticated court dress. The courts of Milan, Ferrara, Mantua, Naples, and other Italian cities became important centers of fashion development. Italian banking families, particularly the Medici of Florence, became important patrons of fashion and luxury production. Their wealth and international connections allowed them to support the finest craftsmen and to influence fashion preferences throughout Europe. The Renaissance, which began in Italy during the late medieval period, brought new aesthetic ideas that influenced fashion development. The Renaissance emphasis on classical learning, individual expression, and artistic excellence created new approaches to fashion that would influence European dress for centuries. Italian fashion was also influenced by the peninsula's complex religious situation. The presence of the papal court at Rome, with its elaborate ceremonial requirements, created demand for the finest liturgical vestments and influenced broader fashion preferences. At the same time, Italy's extensive trade connections with the Islamic world brought non-Christian aesthetic influences that enriched Italian fashion traditions. English distinctiveness and wool dominance. England's island location and distinctive political and economic development created fashion traditions that were sometimes different from continental European trends. English fashion was particularly influenced by the kingdom's dominance of wool production and its distinctive political institutions. England's supremacy in wool production gave English fashion a distinctive character throughout the medieval period. The finest English wool was typically exported to continental textile centers, but domestic production also developed sophisticated techniques for creating luxury woolen cloth. English broadcloth became renowned throughout Europe for its quality and durability. The famous English embroidery tradition, known as Opus Anglicanum, represented one of the highest achievements of medieval textile art. English embroiderers developed distinctive techniques and aesthetic preferences that influenced fashion throughout Europe. Many of the finest liturgical vestments used in continental churches were created in English workshops. English political institutions, particularly the development of Parliament and common law, created a distinctive social structure that influenced fashion preferences. The English emphasis on legal rights and procedural regularity was reflected in more conservative and stable fashion traditions compared to the rapid changes characteristic of continental courts. The English court, while influenced by continental fashions, maintained its own distinctive traditions that reflected English political and cultural values. English royal ceremonial dress incorporated elements that emphasized the constitutional limitations on royal power and the king's role as first among equals rather than absolute monarch. England's extensive wool trade created international connections that influenced English fashion preferences. English merchants and diplomats traveled throughout Europe, bringing back fashion ideas that were adapted to English tastes and circumstances. The development of English universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, created distinctive academic dress traditions that influenced broader fashion preferences. English academic costume became a model that was copied in other parts of Europe and eventually in other parts of the world. Germanic diversity and imperial influence. The Holy Roman Empire's complex political structure, encompassing much of modern Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, and parts of other countries, created enormous diversity in regional fashion traditions. This diversity was balanced by the unifying influence of imperial court fashion and the shared cultural heritage of Germanic peoples. Different regions within the empire developed distinctive fashion traditions that reflected local climate conditions, available materials, and cultural preferences. The textile centers of Augsburg, Nuremberg, and Cologne each developed specializations in particular types of cloth and clothing, creating regional styles that were recognizable throughout the empire. The imperial court, while less influential than the French court, provided some unifying influence on Germanic fashion. The elaborate ceremonies of imperial coronations and other state occasions required appropriate dress that influenced fashion preferences throughout the empire. Germanic fashion was particularly influenced by the region's climate, which required warm, durable clothing suitable for harsh winters. This practical necessity influenced the development of distinctive Germanic approaches to layered clothing, heavy fabrics, and protective outer garments. The empire's extensive trade connections, particularly through the Hanseatic League in northern regions, brought foreign influences to Germanic fashion. The import of furs from Scandinavia and Russia, luxury goods from Italy, and other international products influenced Germanic fashion preferences. Germanic social structures, with their emphasis on feudal relationships and traditional authority, created relatively conservative fashion traditions compared to the rapid changes characteristic of courts in France or Italy. However, the wealth of Germanic cities and the prosperity of the imperial territories allowed for considerable luxury and display in dress. The religious diversity within the empire, while limited compared to modern standards, created some variations in fashion preferences. The different religious traditions of various regions, from the Catholicism of Austria to the distinctive traditions of areas like Bohemia, influenced local dress codes and fashion preferences. Iberian complexity and cultural fusion. The Iberian Peninsula's unique history, with centuries of coexistence between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, created distinctive fashion traditions that incorporated influences from all three cultures. The Christian Reconquista gradually changed these patterns, but Islamic and Jewish influences remained important throughout the medieval period. In Islamic Spain, particularly in major cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada, sophisticated textile traditions developed that influenced fashion throughout the peninsula and beyond. Islamic textile workers developed advanced techniques for silk production, complex pattern weaving, and sophisticated dyeing that set new standards for luxury production. Christian regions of Spain developed their own distinctive traditions that incorporated both Iberian and broader European influences. The Spanish royal courts, particularly as Christian territory expanded during the Reconquista, became important centers of fashion development that combined Islamic sophistication with Christian European traditions. The coexistence of different religious communities created opportunities for cultural exchange that influenced fashion development. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities each contributed techniques, aesthetic preferences, and cultural traditions that enriched Iberian fashion. The Spanish involvement in Mediterranean trade through cities like Barcelona and Valencia brought international influences to Iberian fashion. Trade connections with Italy, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean introduced new materials and aesthetic ideas that were incorporated into Spanish fashion traditions. The development of Spanish wool production, particularly the famous merino sheep, created distinctive Spanish textile traditions. Spanish wool, while different in character from English wool, became highly valued for its fineness and was used for luxury clothing throughout Europe. The late medieval period saw the emergence of a more unified Spanish fashion tradition as the various Christian kingdoms were consolidated under the Catholic monarchs. This unification process influenced fashion preferences and led to the development of distinctively Spanish styles that would become influential in the Renaissance period. Scandinavian adaptations and northern influences. Scandinavia's harsh climate and distinctive cultural traditions created fashion developments that were adapted to northern conditions while maintaining connections to broader European trends. Scandinavian fashion was particularly influenced by the practical necessities of surviving in extreme cold and the cultural traditions of seafaring peoples. The Viking heritage of Scandinavian peoples continued to influence fashion throughout the medieval period, even after the conversion to Christianity and the integration into European political systems. Traditional Scandinavian emphasis on practical, durable clothing suitable for harsh conditions remained important in fashion development. Scandinavian textile production developed distinctive characteristics that reflected local conditions and available materials. The abundance of sheep in many Scandinavian regions led to sophisticated wool production, while the availability of furs from local hunting and trade with more northern regions created distinctive fur-working traditions. The Hanseatic League's dominance of Baltic trade brought international influences to Scandinavian fashion while also spreading Scandinavian products throughout Europe. Cities like Stockholm, Bergen, and Lübeck became important centers for fashion trade and development. The religious diversity of Eastern European regions, with the presence of both Western and Eastern Christianity as well as other religious traditions, created complex influences on fashion development. Different religious communities maintained their own dress traditions while also participating in broader regional fashion trends. 9. Accessories and adornment. Medieval fashion was not merely a matter of basic garments but included an elaborate system of accessories, jewelry, and decorative elements that served both functional and symbolic purposes. These accessories were often crucial in communicating social status, wealth, religious devotion, and personal identity. The sophistication and variety of medieval accessories reflect the complexity of medieval society and the importance placed on visual communication. Jewelry and personal ornaments. Jewelry served multiple functions in medieval society, acting as portable wealth, symbols of status and authority, religious talismans, and personal adornment. The types and quality of jewelry a person wore immediately communicated their place in the social hierarchy and often their specific role or profession. Rings were perhaps the most important type of medieval jewelry, serving not only decorative purposes but also practical functions as seals and symbols of authority. Signet rings, engraved with personal or family arms, were essential tools for authenticating documents in a largely illiterate society. The quality of the metal, the skill of the engraving, and the presence of precious stones all contributed to the ring's value as both a practical tool and a status symbol. The famous episcopal rings worn by bishops and abbots represented spiritual authority and were often elaborate works of art incorporating religious symbolism. These rings were considered so important that they were buried with their wearers, and many examples survive in archaeological contexts. Brooches and fibulae served the practical function of fastening garments while also providing opportunities for decorative display. Early medieval brooches often featured complex geometric or animal motifs that reflected Germanic artistic traditions, while later medieval examples incorporated heraldic devices, religious symbols, and increasingly naturalistic decorative elements. The famous Tara brooch from Ireland, dating to the 8th century, represents one of the finest examples of early medieval metalwork, incorporating intricate interlace patterns, animal motifs, and sophisticated techniques of gold filigree and enamel work. Such elaborate brooches demonstrated not only the wealth of their owners but also the sophisticated artistic traditions of early medieval Europe. Necklaces and chains served both decorative and functional purposes. Heavy gold or silver chains were worn by the wealthy as displays of portable wealth, while more modest chains might support pendants with religious or protective significance. The famous collar of SS, worn by English nobles during the late medieval period, served as a symbol of loyalty to the monarch while also functioning as valuable jewelry. Bracelets and armlets were worn by both men and women throughout the medieval period, though their significance varied by region and social class. In early medieval Germanic societies, arm rings were often given as rewards for military service and served as both personal adornment and portable currency. Earrings were less common in medieval Europe than in some other cultures, partly due to Christian associations between ear piercing and paganism. However, some evidence suggests that earrings were worn by certain groups, particularly in Mediterranean regions where Byzantine and Islamic influences were strong. Belts and girdles. Belts served essential practical functions in medieval dress while also providing important opportunities for display and communication of status. The quality of the belt, its decorative fittings, and the items suspended from it all contributed to the wearer's overall appearance and social presentation. Sword belts were particularly important for the medieval nobility, as the right to bear arms was a crucial marker of noble status. These belts had to be strong enough to support heavy weapons while also serving as displays of wealth and taste. The most elaborate sword belts featured precious metal fittings, jeweled decorations, and sophisticated leatherwork. Women's girdles served different functions from men's belts, often emphasizing the waist and supporting the flowing lines of medieval gowns. These girdles might be made from silk cord, decorated leather, or precious metal chains, depending on the wearer's wealth and the formality of the occasion. The items suspended from belts provided additional opportunities for display and practical functionality. Men might wear purses, keys, knives, and other essential items suspended from their belts, while the quality and decoration of these accessories communicated information about the wearer's occupation and status. Religious girdles, particularly those worn by clergy and members of religious orders, had special symbolic significance. The rope belt worn by Franciscan friars, for example, symbolized their vow of poverty and their binding to religious life, while its 3 knots represented the 3 monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Headwear and hair accessories. Medieval headwear was among the most varied and socially significant categories of accessories, serving functions ranging from practical protection to elaborate social display. The type of headwear a person wore immediately communicated their social rank, occupation, marital status, and regional origin. Crowns and coronets were the most prestigious forms of headwear, reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Medieval crowns evolved from simple metal bands to increasingly elaborate works of art incorporating precious stones, religious symbols, and sophisticated metalwork. The famous crown of Charlemagne, used in Holy Roman Empire coronations, combined Christian symbolism with imperial authority in a design that influenced royal regalia throughout Europe. The development of heraldic coronets created a complex hierarchy of noble headwear, with different designs indicating different ranks of nobility. Dukes, marquises, earls, and other ranks of the peerage each had their appropriate coronet designs, creating a visual system that immediately communicated the wearer's place in the aristocratic hierarchy. Hats and caps varied enormously in style and function, from simple practical coverings to elaborate fashion statements. The famous chaperon, which evolved from a simple hood into a complex turban-like arrangement, became one of the most distinctive elements of late medieval fashion. The chaperon's complex folds and arrangements required considerable skill to achieve and served as a marker of sophistication and fashion awareness. Professional and occupational headwear developed distinctive traditions that made it possible to identify a person's occupation at a glance. Scholars wore distinctive caps that indicated their university affiliation and academic rank, while craftsmen often wore caps or hats specific to their trades. Women's headwear was particularly elaborate and socially significant, reflecting medieval attitudes about female modesty and the importance of covering the hair. Married women were generally expected to cover their hair completely in public, leading to the development of complex systems of veils, wimples, and head coverings. The famous hennin, a tall conical headdress worn with flowing veils, became one of the most characteristic elements of late medieval women's fashion. These extraordinary headdresses could reach heights of several feet and required considerable skill to arrange and wear properly. The height and elaborateness of a woman's headdress often indicated her social rank and the wealth of her family. Hair accessories, while often hidden beneath head coverings, were important elements of medieval fashion. Hairpins, combs, and other accessories were often made from precious materials and decorated with jewels or religious symbols. The famous medieval combs found in archaeological contexts often feature intricate carving and sophisticated artistic designs. Footwear and leg coverings. Medieval footwear evolved from simple protective coverings to elaborate fashion statements that communicated social status and personal taste. The development of sophisticated shoemaking techniques during the medieval period created footwear that combined functionality with artistic achievement. Shoes varied enormously in style and quality, from simple leather coverings for peasants to elaborate works of art for the nobility. The famous polanes, or pointed shoes that became fashionable during the late medieval period, featured extremely long toes that were both impractical and socially significant. The length of the toe was regulated by sumptuary laws, with longer points being reserved for higher social ranks. Boots were essential for military and equestrian activities and developed distinctive styles that reflected their specific functions. Riding boots had to provide protection and support for horseback riding, while military boots needed to be compatible with armor and suitable for combat conditions. Women's shoes were generally less visible than men's due to the long gowns worn throughout the medieval period, but they were often elaborate and expensive. Archaeological finds suggest that wealthy women's shoes were often made from fine leather and decorated with silk, embroidery, or other luxury elements. Hose and leg coverings were crucial elements of medieval dress that required sophisticated tailoring techniques to achieve proper fit. Men's hose evolved from simple leg wrappings to close-fitting garments that required precise cutting and sewing. The development of knitting techniques during the later medieval period allowed for even more precise fitting and greater comfort. The colors and patterns of hose became important elements of medieval fashion, with bright colors and parti-colored, divided, hose becoming particularly fashionable among young nobles. The wearing of one red leg and one blue leg, for example, became a distinctive fashion statement that was both eye-catching and socially significant. Gloves and hand coverings. Gloves served both practical and ceremonial functions in medieval society, protecting the hands while also serving as symbols of authority and social status. The giving and receiving of gloves had important ceremonial significance in medieval culture, particularly in the context of feudal relationships and religious ceremonies. Working gloves were essential for many occupations, from farming and craftsmanship to warfare and hunting. These practical gloves had to provide protection while allowing sufficient dexterity for skilled work. The development of specialized gloves for different occupations reflects the increasing sophistication of medieval craftsmanship. Ceremonial gloves were often elaborate works of art that incorporated precious materials and sophisticated decoration. Bishop's gloves, worn during liturgical ceremonies, often featured religious symbolism and were made from the finest materials available. The famous gloves found in royal and noble burials demonstrate the high level of artistic achievement possible in medieval glove-making. The symbolic significance of gloves in medieval culture extended beyond their practical functions. The throwing down of a glove was a traditional challenge to combat, while the presentation of gloves was often part of ceremonies of homage and loyalty. These symbolic uses gave gloves importance beyond their practical value. Hunting gloves developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the specific requirements of falconry and other hunting activities. These specialized gloves had to provide protection from birds of prey while allowing precise control of the hunting implements. Religious and devotional accessories. Religious accessories were important elements of medieval fashion that served both devotional and decorative purposes. These items allowed medieval people to display their religious devotion while also serving as talismans for protection and good fortune. Pilgrim badges were among the most distinctive religious accessories of the medieval period. These small metal badges, worn on hats or clothing, identified the wearer as having completed a pilgrimage to a particular shrine. The badges served both as proof of the pilgrimage and as protective talismans that were believed to provide divine protection. The famous scallop shell badges worn by pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela became so iconic that they influenced broader fashion trends. Similar badges were produced for other major pilgrimage sites, creating a complex system of religious identification and protection. Rosaries and prayer beads were important devotional accessories that were often made from precious materials and incorporated into fashionable dress. The quality and decoration of rosaries could serve as displays of wealth while also demonstrating religious devotion. Religious medals and pendants allowed medieval people to wear symbols of their faith while also serving decorative functions. These accessories often featured images of saints, religious symbols, or protective prayers, combining religious significance with personal adornment. Reliquaries, small containers holding religious relics, were sometimes worn as personal accessories by the wealthy. These items combined religious significance with displays of wealth and often featured sophisticated metalwork and decoration. Books and writing implements as accessories. In a largely illiterate society, the possession and display of books and writing implements served as powerful indicators of education, status, and sophistication. These items were often treated as luxury accessories rather than merely functional tools. Personal prayer books, or books of hours, became important fashion accessories for the wealthy, particularly women. These illuminated manuscripts were often elaborately decorated and bound in precious materials. The quality and decoration of a person's prayer book served as an indicator of their wealth, piety, and cultural sophistication. Writing tablets, used for taking notes and conducting business, were often made from precious materials and decorated with artistic designs. The quality of a person's writing implements communicated information about their occupation, education, and social status. Seals and seal matrices, used for authenticating documents, were essential accessories for anyone involved in legal or business activities. These items were often elaborate works of art that incorporated personal or family symbols and were made from precious materials. Gaming and entertainment accessories. Medieval society enjoyed various forms of gaming and entertainment, and the accessories associated with these activities often served as displays of wealth and sophistication while providing practical functionality. Chess sets were particularly important gaming accessories that often featured elaborate artistic designs and precious materials. The famous Lewis chessmen, carved from walrus ivory, demonstrate the high level of artistic achievement possible in medieval gaming accessories. Dice and gaming pieces were often made from precious materials and featured sophisticated decoration. The quality of a person's gaming accessories communicated information about their wealth and social status while also providing entertainment. Musical instruments, while primarily functional, also served as fashion accessories that demonstrated cultural sophistication and artistic taste. The decoration and quality of musical instruments often reflected the wealth and status of their owners. Weapons as fashion accessories. In medieval society, the right to bear arms was closely connected to social status, and weapons often served as fashion accessories as much as functional tools. The decoration and quality of weapons communicated important information about the wearer's rank, wealth, and martial identity. Swords were the most important weapons in medieval culture and often featured elaborate decoration that made them works of art as well as functional weapons. The quality of the blade, the sophistication of the hilt decoration, and the presence of precious materials all contributed to the sword's value as both weapon and status symbol. Daggers and knives were commonly worn by men of all social classes but varied enormously in quality and decoration. The wealthy might wear daggers with jeweled hilts and elaborate scabbards, while common men wore simpler but still functional weapons. The ceremonial aspects of weapon wearing created opportunities for fashion display that went beyond mere practical considerations. The way weapons were worn, the quality of their decoration, and their integration into overall costume all contributed to the wearer's social presentation. Conclusion of accessories. The elaborate system of accessories and adornment in medieval fashion reflects the complexity of medieval society and the importance placed on visual communication. These accessories served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided practical utility, communicated social information, demonstrated wealth and taste, and allowed for personal expression within the constraints of social expectations. Understanding medieval accessories is essential for appreciating the full richness and sophistication of medieval fashion and its role in medieval culture. The development of medieval fashion was inextricably linked to the expansion of trade networks and commercial activity throughout Europe and beyond. The availability of materials, the spread of fashion ideas, and the development of specialized fashion industries all depended on the complex commercial systems that connected medieval Europe to the wider world. Understanding the role of trade and commerce is essential for comprehending how medieval fashion evolved from simple, locally produced clothing to the sophisticated international fashion system of the later medieval period. The revival of long-distance trade following the disruptions of the early medieval period had profound effects on fashion and clothing throughout Europe. As trade networks re-established connections between different regions, new materials, techniques, and aesthetic ideas became available to fashion-conscious consumers. The Italian maritime republics played a crucial role in re-establishing trade connections between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi created trading networks that brought Eastern luxuries to European markets while also facilitating cultural exchange that influenced fashion development. Venetian merchants established regular trading relationships with Constantinople, Alexandria, and other Eastern ports, creating reliable supplies of silk, spices, dyes, and other materials essential to luxury fashion. The famous Venetian trade in Eastern goods made Venice one of the wealthiest cities in Europe and a major center of fashion innovation. The development of regular trade routes also facilitated the movement of skilled craftsmen, who carried knowledge of techniques and styles from one region to another. Italian silk weavers learned techniques from Byzantine and Islamic craftsmen, while Northern European textile workers adapted Mediterranean dyeing methods to local conditions. The Crusades, despite their military and religious purposes, also served as important catalysts for trade and cultural exchange. Crusaders returning from the East brought with them new materials, techniques, and aesthetic preferences that influenced European fashion. The establishment of Crusader states in the Eastern Mediterranean created permanent trading posts that facilitated ongoing commercial and cultural exchange. The League's principal trading cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, and Bergen, became important centers for fashion commerce, serving as distribution points for luxury goods throughout Northern Europe. The League's trading posts in London, Bruges, and other major cities created networks that connected northern producers with international markets. The Hanseatic trade in furs was particularly important for medieval fashion. The League controlled the supply of luxury furs from Scandinavia and Russia, including sable, ermine, and other precious furs that were essential elements of aristocratic dress. The quality and rarity of these furs made them extremely valuable, and their distribution through Hanseatic networks influenced fashion preferences throughout Europe. The League also facilitated trade in amber, which was highly prized for jewelry and decorative purposes. Baltic amber was traded throughout Europe and became an important element in medieval fashion accessories. The League's control of amber supplies gave Northern European merchants significant influence in international luxury markets. The Champagne fairs and textile commerce. The famous trade fairs of Champagne, held in cities like Troyes, Provence, Lagny, and Barcelone, became crucial centers for textile commerce during the High Medieval period. These fairs brought together merchants from throughout Europe and facilitated the exchange of materials, finished goods, and fashion ideas. The Champagne fairs operated on regular annual cycles that allowed merchants to plan their business activities around predictable trading opportunities. The fairs provided secure trading environments with established legal procedures for resolving commercial disputes, making them attractive to merchants from distant regions. Italian merchants used the Champagne fairs to sell luxury textiles, particularly silk fabrics and fine woolen cloth, to customers throughout Northern Europe. Flemish textile producers brought their products to the fairs, where they competed with Italian goods for international markets. English wool merchants sold their raw materials to continental processors who would return with finished cloth. The fairs also served as centers for fashion information exchange, where merchants, nobles, and other fashion-conscious individuals could observe new styles and trends. The concentration of luxury goods and sophisticated customers at the fairs made them important centers for fashion innovation and diffusion. The development of credit systems and banking services at the Champagne fairs facilitated large-scale textile commerce. Italian bankers provided financial services that allowed merchants to conduct business across long distances and extended time periods, making possible the complex commercial relationships that supported international fashion trade. Islamic trade networks and Eastern influences. The extensive trade networks of the Islamic world provided crucial connections between European fashion markets and the luxury producers of Asia and Africa. Islamic merchants controlled many of the trade routes that brought silk, spices, dyes, and other luxury goods from Asia to European markets. The Islamic cities of Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were important centers of luxury textile production that influenced European fashion preferences. Islamic textile workers developed sophisticated techniques for silk weaving, dyeing, and decorative work that set standards for luxury throughout the medieval world. The famous Damascus silk and other Islamic textiles became highly prized in European markets, influencing both fashion preferences and production techniques. European textile workers studied Islamic textiles and adapted Islamic techniques to create their own luxury products. Islamic control of many spice and dye trades gave Islamic merchants significant influence over European fashion colors and preferences. The availability of particular dyes often determined fashion color trends, while the rarity and expense of certain materials influenced their social significance. The complex relationships between Christian and Islamic merchants, despite religious differences and military conflicts, facilitated extensive commercial and cultural exchange. The practical necessities of trade often overcame religious and political obstacles, allowing for the continued flow of goods and ideas that were essential to fashion development. The development of commercial centers. The growth of specialized commercial centers throughout Europe created networks of cities that served particular functions in the international fashion trade. These centers developed distinctive specializations that contributed to the overall sophistication of European fashion commerce. Bruges emerged as one of the most important commercial centers in Northern Europe, serving as a hub for textile trade between England, Flanders, and the rest of Europe. The city's strategic location and sophisticated commercial infrastructure made it a natural center for international fashion commerce. Florence became a major center for luxury textile production and international banking, with Florentine merchants and bankers playing crucial roles in financing fashion trade throughout Europe. The city's silk industry, established during the late medieval period, quickly achieved international recognition for quality and innovation. Paris developed as both a center of fashion consumption, through the royal court and wealthy urban population, and fashion production, through its sophisticated craft guilds and workshops. The city's position as the French capital gave it political importance that enhanced its commercial significance. Milan became important for both silk production and international trade, serving as a connection point between Italian producers and Northern European markets. The city's strategic location in the Po Valley made it a natural center for commerce between Italy and the rest of Europe. London developed as the principal center for English wool exports while also becoming an important market for imported luxury goods. The city's growth as a commercial center was closely linked to England's dominance in wool production and the international demand for English wool. Wealthy merchant families became important patrons of fashion and luxury production, often rivaling the traditional nobility in their displays of wealth and sophistication. These merchant patrons played crucial roles in supporting fashion industries and driving innovation in textile production. The Medici family of Florence exemplifies the importance of merchant patronage in fashion development. Their banking wealth allowed them to commission elaborate clothing and textiles while also supporting the craftsmen and artists who created luxury goods. Medici patronage helped establish Florence as a major center of Renaissance fashion and luxury production. Similar patterns developed in other commercial centers, where wealthy merchant families used fashion and luxury display as means of establishing their social position and competing with traditional elites. This competition drove demand for increasingly sophisticated and innovative fashion products. Merchant patronage also supported the development of new techniques and technologies in textile production. Wealthy merchants were willing to invest in experimental techniques and new equipment that might provide competitive advantages in luxury markets. The international connections of merchant families facilitated the spread of fashion ideas and techniques across political boundaries. Merchant families with operations in multiple cities could transfer knowledge and techniques from one location to another, contributing to the international character of late medieval fashion. Banking and credit systems. The development of sophisticated banking and credit systems during the medieval period was essential for supporting the complex commercial relationships that made international fashion trade possible. These financial innovations allowed merchants to conduct business across long distances and extended time periods. Italian banking houses, particularly those based in Florence, Siena, and other commercial centers, developed credit instruments that facilitated international trade. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and other financial tools allowed merchants to conduct business without transporting large amounts of cash over dangerous distances. The availability of credit allowed fashion merchants to maintain larger inventories and to invest in more expensive materials and production techniques. This financial support was crucial for the development of luxury fashion industries that required significant capital investment. Banking relationships also facilitated the movement of skilled craftsmen and the transfer of technical knowledge between different regions. Italian bankers often financed the establishment of textile workshops in other regions, bringing Italian techniques and expertise to new markets. The integration of European financial systems during the later medieval period created a unified commercial environment that supported international fashion trade. Merchants could conduct business throughout Europe using standardized financial instruments and procedures. Technological innovation and commercial competition. Commercial competition drove technological innovation in textile production, as producers sought competitive advantages in international markets. The development of new techniques and technologies was often motivated by the desire to create products that could compete successfully with established producers. The introduction of new types of looms, spinning wheels, and other textile equipment was often driven by commercial considerations. Producers who could create better or more efficiently produced textiles could gain advantages in competitive markets. The development of new dyeing techniques and the search for new dye materials were motivated by the desire to create distinctive products that would appeal to fashion-conscious consumers. The discovery of new dyes or improved dyeing techniques could provide significant commercial advantages. The competition between different textile centers led to continuous innovation and improvement in production techniques. Italian producers competed with Flemish producers, while both competed with emerging centers in other regions, driving continuous improvement in quality and innovation in design. Commercial considerations also influenced the development of new styles and fashions. Producers and merchants were constantly seeking new products that would appeal to consumers and provide profitable opportunities for trade. The impact of political changes on trade. Political changes throughout the medieval period had significant impacts on trade patterns and fashion development. Wars, treaties, and political alliances all influenced the flow of goods and the development of fashion industries. The 100 Years' War between England and France disrupted traditional trade patterns and forced merchants to develop new routes and relationships. The war's impact on the wool trade was particularly significant, as it interrupted the traditional flow of English wool to Flemish processors. The expansion of Ottoman power in the eastern Mediterranean during the late medieval period disrupted traditional trade routes and forced European merchants to seek alternative sources for Eastern goods. This disruption contributed to the search for new routes to Asia that would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration. Political alliances often facilitated trade relationships and influenced fashion development. The marriage alliances between different royal families created diplomatic relationships that supported commercial exchange and cultural influence. The development of more centralized monarchies during the later medieval period created more stable political environments that supported long-distance trade. The establishment of royal courts as centers of fashion consumption also created new markets for luxury goods. Conclusion of trade and commerce. The role of trade and commerce in medieval fashion development cannot be overstated. The revival of long-distance trade, the development of sophisticated commercial networks, and the growth of international markets created the conditions that made possible the flowering of medieval fashion. The competition between different commercial centers drove innovation and improvement in textile production, while the availability of international markets supported the development of luxury fashion industries. The financial innovations of the medieval period provided the credit systems necessary for complex international trade, while political developments influenced trade patterns and market opportunities. Understanding these commercial relationships is essential for comprehending how medieval fashion evolved from simple, locally produced clothing to the sophisticated international fashion system that characterized the later medieval period and laid the foundations for Renaissance fashion development. The history of medieval fashion from 500 to 1500 CE represents a remarkable transformation from the simple, practical garments of the early medieval period to the sophisticated, internationally influenced fashion system of the Renaissance era. This millennium-long evolution reflects broader changes in European society, economy, culture, and technology, while also demonstrating the crucial role that clothing and fashion played in medieval life. The arc of medieval fashion development. The trajectory of medieval fashion development can be understood as a movement from simplicity to complexity, from local to international, and from purely functional to increasingly aesthetic considerations. The early medieval period's emphasis on practical, durable clothing gradually gave way to the elaborate, fashion-conscious dress of the later medieval courts. This transformation was not merely a matter of changing tastes or increasing wealth, though both factors were important. Rather, it reflected fundamental changes in medieval society, the revival of urban life, the development of specialized crafts, the growth of international trade, the emergence of new social classes, and the increasing sophistication of European culture. The early medieval synthesis of Roman and Germanic clothing traditions created the foundation for all subsequent European fashion development. The basic garments that emerged from this synthesis, the tunic, the gown, the cloak, remained fundamental elements of European dress throughout the medieval period, even as their construction, decoration, and social significance evolved dramatically. The high medieval period's development of fitted clothing techniques represented a technological and aesthetic revolution that made possible all subsequent fashion innovation. The ability to create closely fitted garments that followed the contours of the human body opened new possibilities for both aesthetic expression and social communication through dress. The late medieval period's embrace of rapid fashion change and international style created the conceptual framework for modern fashion. The idea that clothing styles should change regularly, that fashion should be international in scope, and that staying current with fashion trends was socially important all emerged during this period. Social and cultural significance. Medieval fashion was never merely a matter of personal preference or aesthetic choice. In a society where literacy was limited and visual symbols carried enormous weight, clothing served as a sophisticated system of communication that conveyed information about social rank, occupation, regional origin, religious affiliation, and personal identity. The elaborate sumptuary laws of the medieval period, despite their limited practical effectiveness, demonstrate the importance that medieval society placed on maintaining legible social hierarchies through dress. The repeated attempts to regulate fashion suggest both the power of clothing to communicate social information and the difficulty of controlling this communication in a dynamic society. The role of fashion in maintaining and challenging social boundaries was particularly significant during periods of rapid social change. The economic growth of the High Medieval period and the social disruption of the Late Medieval period created new opportunities for social mobility, and fashion became both a means of claiming new status and a target for those who wished to preserve traditional hierarchies. The relationship between fashion and religious authority remained complex throughout the medieval period. While religious leaders consistently warned about the spiritual dangers of excessive attention to dress, the church itself was one of the most important patrons of luxury textile production and developed some of the most sophisticated symbolic dress systems in medieval society. Technological and economic foundations. The development of medieval fashion was made possible by significant advances in textile technology and the growth of sophisticated commercial systems. The revival of long-distance trade, the development of specialized craft production, and the emergence of international financial systems created the economic infrastructure necessary for a flourishing fashion industry. The technological innovations of the medieval period, improved looms, spinning wheels, new dyeing techniques, and sophisticated tailoring methods, made possible the creation of textiles and garments that far exceeded anything available in the early medieval period. These innovations were driven partly by commercial competition and partly by the demands of increasingly sophisticated consumers. The guild system, despite its limitations and restrictions, provided the organizational framework for maintaining quality standards and training skilled craftsmen. The guild system also facilitated the transfer of techniques and knowledge between different regions, contributing to the international character of late medieval fashion. The development of banking and credit systems was crucial for supporting the complex commercial relationships that made international fashion trade possible. The ability to finance large textile purchases, support skilled craftsmen, and maintain international trading relationships required sophisticated financial instruments that were developed during the medieval period. Regional diversity and international integration. One of the most remarkable features of medieval fashion was its ability to maintain regional distinctiveness while participating in increasingly international trends. Different regions of Europe developed characteristic styles and specializations that reflected local conditions, cultural preferences, and political circumstances, while also participating in broader European fashion developments. The tension between regional identity and international influence created much of the dynamism of medieval fashion. Local traditions provided stability and identity, while international influences brought innovation and change. The most successful fashion centers were those that managed to balance these competing demands effectively. The development of international fashion communication networks, through trade, diplomacy, dynastic marriages, and cultural exchange, created the foundations for the global fashion system that would emerge in subsequent centuries. The medieval period established many of the patterns of fashion communication and influence that continue to operate today. Medieval fashion provided crucial means for expressing and negotiating identity within the constraints of medieval society. The elaborate dress codes that governed different social groups, while restrictive in many ways, also provided frameworks within which individuals could express their identity and aspirations. The gendered nature of medieval fashion reflected broader medieval ideas about appropriate roles for men and women, but it also created opportunities for challenging and subverting these expectations. The historical record contains numerous examples of individuals who used clothing to challenge conventional gender roles and social expectations. The relationship between fashion and social class remained complex throughout the medieval period. While sumptuary laws attempted to maintain clear distinctions between different social groups, The reality was often more fluid, with successful merchants challenging traditional aristocratic monopolies on luxury dress and new social groups developing their own distinctive fashion traditions. Religious and symbolic dimensions. The symbolic dimensions of medieval fashion were as important as its practical and aesthetic functions. Colors, materials, decorative motifs, and construction techniques all carried symbolic meanings that added layers of significance to medieval dress. The development of Christian liturgical vestments created one of the most sophisticated symbolic dress systems in human history, while the symbolic associations of different materials and colors influenced broader fashion preferences. The medieval period established many of the color symbolisms and material associations that continue to influence fashion today. The role of fashion in expressing religious devotion, regional identity, and political allegiance demonstrates the power of clothing to communicate complex cultural meanings. Medieval fashion was never merely decorative but always carried significant cultural and social content. Legacy and influence. The fashion developments of the medieval period laid the foundations for all subsequent European fashion development. The basic garment types, construction techniques, symbolic associations, and commercial systems established during the medieval period continued to influence European fashion well into the modern period. The medieval development of fashion as a social and economic system, with regular style changes, international influence, commercial competition, and sophisticated production techniques, created the conceptual framework for modern fashion. The idea that fashion should be dynamic, international, and commercially driven all emerged during the medieval period. The medieval period also established many of the institutional frameworks that would support later fashion development: guild systems, international trade networks, banking systems, and court cultures that served as centers of fashion innovation and diffusion. Final reflections. The study of medieval fashion reveals the sophistication and complexity of medieval society and challenges many stereotypes about the medieval period as a time of simplicity and uniformity. The elaborate fashion systems of medieval Europe demonstrate the creativity, technical skill, and cultural sophistication of medieval people. Medieval fashion also reveals the fundamental human drive to use clothing for communication, identity expression, and aesthetic pleasure. Despite the very different social and economic conditions of medieval society, many of the basic motivations and patterns of fashion behavior established during this period continue to operate today. The thousand-year development of medieval fashion from 500 to 1500 CE represents one of the most remarkable cultural transformations in human history. The simple, practical garments of the early medieval period evolved into the sophisticated, internationally influenced fashion system that would provide the foundation for Renaissance fashion and, ultimately, modern fashion. This transformation reflects the broader development of European civilization and demonstrates the crucial role that fashion and clothing have played in human culture throughout history. The legacy of medieval fashion extends far beyond the specific garments and styles of the period. The medieval development of fashion as a system of social communication, economic activity, and cultural expression established patterns that continue to influence how we think about and use clothing today. Understanding medieval fashion is therefore essential not only for understanding medieval society but also for understanding the deeper cultural forces that continue to shape fashion and dress in the contemporary world.